The scent hit him before the boy opened his mouth. Kalen Ashmore had led wars, buried enemies, and built a throne on the back of his own silence. But nothing in 34 years of blood and iron had prepared him for the smell of his own bloodline walking into the room on legs that barely reached the council table. A child. 7 years old, eyes like cold creek water and a jaw set with the kind of stubbornness that doesn't come from courage. It comes from never being taught fear. And when that boy looked straight into the eyes of the most dangerous alpha in the Northern Realm and said, without flinching, without hesitation, "My father died 7 years ago," the room stopped breathing. Drop your city below. Watch until the very last word. Because what happens next will rearrange everything you thought you knew about loyalty, betrayal, and the price a kingdom pays when it buries the truth alive. The Thornwall Summit happened once every 7 years, and it happened on neutral ground. That was the rule. Older than any single pack, older than the current boundaries drawn in blood and ink across the Northern Territories. 12 packs, one gathering, no weapons drawn on the floor of the Thornwall Hall. The structure itself was built from black granite hauled down from the Ashridge Mountains 3 generations back, commissioned by Kalen's grandfather during the last Great Territorial War, a monument to the idea that wolves who could sit across a table from each other might, occasionally, stop tearing each other's throats out long enough to talk. It had never fully worked. But it kept happening. Kalen arrived last, which was intentional. He arrived last because every alpha in that room needed to be seated and settled and already tired of waiting by the time he walked through the doors. Tired men made smaller postures. Smaller postures meant the negotiation was already half won before the first word was spoken. He walked in with Drace on his left and Petra on his right, his 2 most trusted lieutenants, and he didn't break stride crossing the threshold. The hall smelled of pine pitch from the torches, cold stone, and the mingled scents of 11 other bloodlines all trying to hold their territorial instincts in check. Under that, wet leather, boot grease, the faint iron smell of old arguments. Kalen knew every face at the table before he reached his chair. Elder Voss Hartwell from the Iron Gate pack, 70 years old and still built like a man who had spent his youth dragging sleds through mountain snow. His 2 seconds flanked him like bookends. Across from him, Alpha Sora Marek of the Stonefen pack, 40 years old, recently consolidated her 3 eastern territories through a combination of strategic marriage and one very well-timed fire. Next to her, the Coldwater twins from the northern coast, nominally 1 pack, functionally 2, and everyone at this table knew it, but nobody said it out loud because that particular argument had already killed 4 mediators over the past decade. Kalen took his seat at the head of the table, which was not technically designated as the head, but which became it the moment he sat down. "Gentlemen," he said. "Ladies." "You're 20 minutes late," Hartwell said. "I am," Kalen agreed. He picked up the clay cup in front of him, smelled the contents, water, clean, no additives, and set it back down. "Let's begin." Drace pulled out the territorial maps and spread them across the center of the table without being asked. Petra positioned herself 2 steps behind Kalen's right shoulder, where she would remain until the session ended, or until someone made a move that required her to respond. These were old patterns, worn smooth by repetition, and Kalen settled into them the way a man settles into a chair he's occupied so many times the wood has taken the shape of his body. The first hour was boundary disputes. 4 of them, layered on top of each other like badly patched wounds. The Grafen corridor that both the Iron Gate and Coldwater packs claimed as a secondary migration route. The contested trapping grounds at the base of the Ashridge, 2 villages on the eastern ridge that had shifted pack allegiance twice in 6 years, and were currently functioning under a kind of terrified neutrality. Kalen listened more than he spoke. Listening was a weapon most alphas never learned to use because their instincts pushed them toward dominance displays instead of information gathering, and information was more valuable than every show of strength he'd ever witnessed combined. He watched Hartwell's hands when the old man talked about the Grafen corridor. They stayed flat on the table, no unconscious clenching, no territorial reflex. Hartwell didn't actually want the corridor, he wanted something else, and the corridor was his opening bid. He watched Alpha Marek's second, a lean young man named Callius, who kept glancing at the eastern ridge markings on the map. Not Marek herself, Callius. Someone in the Stonefen pack had a personal stake in those villages that their alpha either didn't know about or had chosen to bring to this table without mentioning. Kalen noted both things and said nothing about either. The disputes wound through their first round. Positions staked out, countered, partially retreated from. The usual architecture of negotiation, everyone pretending their opening offer was their final word, everyone knowing it wasn't. He was halfway through the second round, drawing Hartwell out on the real issue beneath the Grafen claim, when the doors at the far end of the hall opened. Not the main doors. The side door, the one reserved for runners and message carriers, and the kind of urgent interruptions that couldn't wait for a session recess. Kalen didn't look up. One of his perimeter guards would handle it. But then the smell hit him. It came across the hall like a physical thing. Not strong, not overpowering, but distinct in a way that bypassed every rational filter and landed somewhere deeper. His own bloodline, yes. But younger, lighter, mixed with something else. Something that raised the hairs on the back of his neck in a way that had nothing to do with threat detection and everything to do with a recognition his body arrived at several seconds before his mind did. He looked up. The boy was already through the door, 7 years old maybe. Small for his age, or perhaps exactly right for his age. Kalen was not experienced enough with children to know the difference. Dark hair that needed cutting, pushed back from a face that was still soft in the way children's faces were, but with something behind the eyes that wasn't soft at all. He was dressed simply, worn trousers, a rough spun shirt that had been washed many times, boots that were practical rather than fine. He moved like a child who had spent his life outdoors, with that particular economy of movement that came from navigating difficult terrain. He walked into the hall and he looked directly at Kalen. Not at the table, not at the assembled alphas, not at the guards who had registered his entry and were already moving to intercept. At Kalen. Children did not look at Kalen that way. Adults with considerably more experience and considerably more spine didn't look at Kalen that way. There was no defiance in it. Defiance required an opponent, required the conscious staging of a confrontation. This was something else. This was a child looking at a thing he had been trying to find for a long time and finally locating it across a room. Kalen's guard Toron reached the boy first, stepping in front of him with one hand raised. "Summit's closed, kid. Runners only through that door." The boy looked at Toron without particular concern, the way a very focused person looks at an obstacle they plan to go around rather than through. "I need to talk to him," the boy said. His voice was higher than Kalen expected, still that reedy pitch of young childhood, but the cadence was older, slower. "You're not cleared for—" "I need to talk to him," the boy said again. The room had gone quiet in the way rooms go quiet when something has entered that nobody has a protocol for. The alphas at the table had stopped their arguments. The seconds and lieutenants had straightened in their chairs. Everyone was watching. Kalen raised 2 fingers. Torin stepped back. "Let him through," Kalen said. Torin hesitated exactly 1/2 second, the limit of what his discipline allowed before training overrode instinct, and then stepped aside. The boy walked to the table. He walked to Kalen's end of it, stopped about 6 feet away, and looked up at him. Up close the scent was stronger, and it was wrong. Not wrong like a lie. Wrong like a piece of a thing that had no business being here, that belonged to a different story, that had gotten loose from somewhere it should have stayed contained. Wrong like finding your own handwriting in a letter you don't remember writing. "Who are you?" Kalen asked. The boy's jaw tightened in a way that was startlingly familiar, though Kalen had never in his life seen this child before. "My name is Orion," the boy said. "Orion." Kalen kept his voice level. "Who brought you here, Orion?" "I came myself." "That's not what My father died 7 years ago." The silence that followed was absolute. Not the silence of a room that has paused, the silence of a room that has been struck. 12 alphas, 24 seconds and lieutenants, every guard along every wall, every single person in the Thornwall Hall experienced the same half-second of complete suspension, as if the air itself had been knocked out of the building. Kalen stared at the boy. The boy stared back at him. "My father died before I was born," Orion said. "That's what my mother told me. She said he was She said he was gone. That's what she told everyone. A pause. His small hands were at his sides, not quite clenched, but close. But I found some things, and I don't think she was telling the truth. I think she was trying to protect me. Another pause. From you. Somewhere to Kalen's left, he heard Hartwell make a sound that wasn't quite a word. Somewhere behind him, Petra had gone completely still. He could feel it without turning around, the particular quality of her stillness that meant she was calculating 17 different scenarios simultaneously and waiting to see which one materialized. Kalen said nothing. "You smell like me," Orion said. "I didn't know what that meant before. I know what it means now." The table erupted. Not violently. The summit's rules held as they always held because breaking them had consequences that went beyond any single dispute. But the eruption was real. Voices raised, chairs shifted, the Coldwater twins both speaking at once while Hartwell's second leaned in toward the old man's ear, and from across the hall one of Marek's guards had already moved toward the side door as if to check whether anyone else was coming through it. Kalen ignored all of it. "Where's your mother?" he asked. Something moved across the boy's face, fast, quickly controlled, but he was 7 years old and his control was imperfect, and Kalen caught it. Fear. Not of Kalen specifically, not in this moment, something else. Something that had happened before this moment, before this hall. "She told me to wait outside," the boy said. "Outside this hall?" "Outside the village. She said to wait by the well." He paused. "I didn't wait." Kalen turned to Drace. "Find her." Drace was already moving. "What is her name?" Kalen asked, turning back to the boy. The boy's jaw tightened again. "She goes by Mara," he said. "But that's not—" He stopped. "Not what?" "That's not what she told me her real name was, before she stopped talking about it." Kalen's chest was doing something he didn't have a name for. It was not pain. He knew pain in its every register from surface cut to deep structural damage, and this was none of those. It was more like pressure, like something that had been sealed in a container for a long time, and the container's integrity had just been compromised. He had been 26 years old when his mate disappeared. He was not going to think about that now, in this room, with 12 alphas watching his face for information they could use against him. He looked at Orion. "How did you find this gathering?" "I listened," the boy said simply. "My mother listens to everything. I learned from her." "She didn't want you here." "No." "But you came anyway." "Yes." Kalen held the boy's gaze for a long moment. Those eyes, the shape of them, the particular shade of gray-green that he associated with cold mornings, and one specific face that he had spent 7 years trying to stop associating with anything at all. "Sit down," Kalen said finally. He gestured to Torin. "Bring him a chair. Don't put it at the table, against the wall, there." "Kalen," Hartwell said, his voice carrying the careful weight of a man who knew he was treading somewhere sensitive. "This is a summit session. Whatever this is." "I'm aware of what this is, Hartwell." Kalen looked at the old man. "And you'll sit down and wait." Hartwell sat down. Kalen looked around the room, not quickly, but slowly, making contact with each alpha in turn. Not a challenge. Something older than a challenge. A statement of fact. "This is my hall right now, whatever the architecture says about neutrality. Move carefully." Nobody moved. Torin placed a chair against the wall to the left of the main doors, and Orion walked to it without being told twice. He sat with his hands flat on his knees, watching everything with those steady gray-green eyes. And Kalen noted with something that might have been reluctant recognition that the boy showed no interest in performing distress or bravado for the audience around him. He simply watched, filed, waited. "We will recess for 20 minutes, Kalen said to the table. "The summit schedule," Marek's second began. 20 minutes, Kalen said, and his voice had the particular quality it got when the discussion was finished, and everyone at that table recognized it because everyone at that table had spent years learning to recognize it from a safe distance. The summit recessed. Most of the alphas and their seconds filtered out through the main doors toward the adjacent hall where refreshments were laid out, taking their arguments and their speculations with them. Kalen watched them go and noted who lingered near the door rather than proceeding fully through, noted who sent their second back for an apparently forgotten item that required a slow pass through the main hall. Information was being gathered. That was inevitable. He had perhaps 4 minutes before whatever Drace found outside became known to at least 3 other parties in this building. He crossed the hall to where Orion sat. The boy watched him approach without flinching. Up close, closer than they'd been across the table, the scent of his bloodline was undeniable. Not a resemblance, not a suggestion. A biological fact. Kalen crouched down so he was at the boy's level, which put a small strain on his knees that he ignored. He looked at him directly. "How long have you known?" he asked. Orion considered the question seriously, the way children occasionally did when they decided an adult was worth the effort of a serious answer. "Really known? Since last winter, when I found the box." "What box?" "My mother had a box hidden under the floor of our house. She thought I didn't know where it was." A slight pause. "I knew where it was." "What was in it?" "Papers. Some of them were in a language I don't read, but some weren't." He hesitated. "There was a sigil. The Ashmore sigil. I recognized it because—" He stopped again, and this time the stop was different, older, like he was making a decision. "Because," Kalen prompted, "because she used to draw it, when she thought I was asleep, on the windowsill with her finger, over and over." His voice didn't change much. Children's voices, Kalen was learning in real time, carried emotion differently, more flatly sometimes in ways that made the emotion more rather than less visible. "I thought it was just something she did. A habit. But after I found the box, I understood what it meant." Kalen's jaw was tight. He kept it controlled. "She never told you anything?" "She told me my father was gone. She told me he had been a strong man who loved his people. She told me—" The boy's hands pressed flat against his knees, a small, unconscious gesture. "She told me he wouldn't have left us if he'd had a choice. That's what she always said. He wouldn't have left us if he'd had a choice." The pressure in Kalen's chest did something complicated. "And you believed her?" "I believe she believed it," Orion said, with the precision of someone who had thought about the difference between those two things and found it significant. "But believing something doesn't always make it true. She taught me that." Kalen was quiet for a moment. From outside, through the thick granite walls, he could hear the muffled sounds of 24 people doing their best to pretend they weren't straining to hear what was happening inside. "Your mother," he said. "The name Mara. When did she start using it?" "I don't know. Before I was born. She said—" He stopped. Something shifted in his expression, some quick internal calculation. "She said she was protecting us from people who would hurt us if they knew who we really were. She never told me who those people were." "But you have ideas." "Yes." "Tell me." The boy met his eyes steadily. "The people who told you she was gone," he said. "That's who I think. Because she's not gone. She's been hiding, and people hide from whoever it was that made them disappear." Kalen stood up. He stood up because staying crouched down was no longer physically sustainable, not for structural reasons, but because the conversation had reached a point where he needed the full height of himself, the full weight of his own presence, to process what this 7-year-old had just said to him with the calm certainty of someone reporting observed facts. He turned away and looked at the far wall for 3 seconds. Let his breath go out slow and controlled and silent. Then he turned back. "Orion," he said, "I need you to stay in this room with Toran." He looked at his guard, who had remained stationed by the door throughout all of this. "Nobody goes near him. Nobody." "Yes, sir," Toran said. "The people outside this hall," Kalen said to Orion. "Some of them are going to want to talk to you. None of them should. Do you understand?" "Yes." "If anyone approaches you who isn't me or Toran, you don't answer questions. You don't confirm anything. You give them nothing." "I understand." A pause. "I've been doing that my whole life." Kalen looked at him for one more second, at this boy who had his eyes and his jaw and the specific cast of his stubbornness, who had walked into a room full of the most dangerous people in the Northern Territories and opened his mouth and detonated something that could not be undetonated. And then he walked toward the side door. Drace was waiting in the narrow corridor outside, which was dark and smelled of old mortar and torch smoke. His lieutenant's face was closed in the particular way it got when the news was structured in layers. "Tell me," Kaelin said. "We found the well she told him to wait at. 3 of her people were there, traveling party of 6 total, by the sign. They're gone, moved out fast within the last hour, before the boy walked into the hall." Kaelin absorbed this. She ran. She ran. She knew he was going to come in. Or she was already planning to run. Hard to say which. Drace hesitated, an unusual thing for Drace, who had served Kaelin for 12 years and delivered bad news the way other men delivered weather reports. "There's something else. Say it." "One of Hartwell's men found me outside." Said his alpha requests a private word before the session resumes. Said, Drace's voice stayed flat. Said it was about a matter of bloodline legitimacy that the Iron Gate Pack had been made aware of several years ago. The sentence arrived and settled, and Kaelin stood with it for a moment in the dark of the corridor. Hartwell had known. Hartwell, or someone in his circle, had known something years ago about a bloodline matter connected to Kaelin. Had known and had said nothing. Not to Kaelin's face, not through any of the usual channels. Had kept it in a pocket all this time, and now that a 7-year-old boy had walked into a summit hall and blown the whole structure open, Hartwell was positioning himself to leverage whatever he knew. "Tell him I'll speak with him after I've addressed the full table," Kaelin said. "He won't like that." "He'll like the alternative less." Kaelin's voice had gone quiet in the register that Drace had learned over 12 years to pay close attention to. "Send 2 more to the roads leading out of the village. I want to know which direction she went." "Already sent." "And Drace." Kaelin looked at his lieutenant directly. "The 7 years of her disappearance. Every account, every report. I want every piece of paper that touched this matter on my table by nightfall." Drace's expression didn't change. "Some of those accounts came through the Elder Council. I know where they came from. Asking for them reopens. I know what it reopens." A pause. "Do it anyway." Drace nodded once and moved back down the corridor. Kaelin stood alone in the dark for exactly 4 breaths. He allowed himself 4 breaths because that was what it took to put things back in their containers. The pressure in his chest, the specific image of gray-green eyes that had surfaced 7 times in the past 20 minutes, the 7 years of reports he had read and believed and built the structure of his certainty on. 4 breaths to acknowledge that the structure was now rubble. Then he walked back into the hall. The summit had reassembled itself without being called to do so, which meant everyone had decided the situation was urgent enough that pretending to wait for refreshments wasn't worth the pretense. 12 alphas at the table, their seconds behind them, the guards along the walls. Hartwell had the careful expression of a man with a handful of cards trying to look like he was playing chess. Kaelin walked to his seat, stood behind it, and looked at the table. "The session will resume," he said. "The boundary matters on the Grafen corridor will be addressed by end of day. The Eastern Ridge villages will go to arbitration." He looked at Hartwell. "Before we continue, Elder Hartwell has indicated he has information regarding a bloodline matter." Hartwell. The old man straightened. Around the table, the quality of attention sharpened. Everyone in this room had just watched what happened with the boy, and everyone was already doing the arithmetic. 7 years ago, Hartwell said, his voice measured, his hands still flat on the table, but they weren't flat now. One hand had curled slightly at the edge. "My pack's intelligence network received word of a woman traveling under a false name through our western territories. A woman carrying a child." He paused. "The woman's scent was brought to our attention by a tracker who had previously served the Ashmore pack. He identified her as her name," Kaelin said. Hartwell's eyes held his. The tracker named her as Celine Voss. The room received this the way it had received Orion's words, with that complete suspension, the held breath of people hearing something that lands at an angle they weren't prepared for. Celine Voss. Not a woman traveling under a false name, not Mara. Celine Voss, who had been his mate, who had been found, allegedly found, dead in the northern wetlands 7 years ago, whose body had been identified by 3 Elder Council witnesses and carried back to Ashridge territory and given a burial that Kaylin had not attended because he was 3 territories away fighting a war that had been declared the week she disappeared, who had been dead for 7 years, who was apparently alive and running from a village less than 2 miles from this hall. "You received this intelligence 7 years ago," Kaylin said. His voice was perfectly level. There was a great deal of work happening beneath that levelness, and none of it was visible. "And you're telling me now." The political situation at the time, "You're telling me now," Kaylin repeated, "because a child walked into this room and you realized your intelligence had just become public knowledge." He looked at the old man with the particular quality of attention that alphas learn to read the way other people read weather. "Which means you have 7 years of knowing something that should have reached me 7 years ago, and you chose to hold it. Kaylin, this session is not the place for that conversation." Kaylin looked at the rest of the table. "The summit schedule will continue. Hartwell and I will speak privately this evening." He looked at Hartwell one more time, long enough for the old man to understand that the private conversation was not optional and was not going to be comfortable. "Sit." Hartwell sat. The session resumed with the particular brittle quality of a room that had been cracked and was holding itself together through collective agreement that cracking further would be worse. Arguments were made. Concessions were offered. The Grafen corridor wound toward a tentative resolution. Kaylin managed all of it with the surface of himself while the rest of him worked on an entirely different problem. Celine had been alive. Celine had been alive for 7 years, living under a false name, traveling with a child, his bloodline, unmistakable, and not a single person in his own elder council had seen fit to correct the record they had established. 3 witnesses. 3 elder council witnesses had identified a body. He had trusted them the way he'd trusted the structure beneath his feet, not with attention, not consciously, but with the deepest possible assumption, the kind that doesn't even register as trust, because the alternative is too fundamental to consider. And they had lied. He had spent 7 years believing his mate was dead. He had spent 7 years rebuilding himself around that fact. Not healing, because healing was not something alphas were taught to do, but fortifying. Building the structure of himself higher and harder and less permeable, because that was what survival required when the wound couldn't be closed. He had spent 7 years becoming the version of himself that sat at the head of this table, feared and functional and alone in the specific way that people who have been alone for a long time are alone. And she had been alive. He had a son. The session broke at midday for the meal recess, and as the hall emptied, Kaylin crossed to where Orion still sat against the wall, Torrin stationed beside him. The boy had eaten something at some point. There was a bread heel on the floor next to his chair, and he watched Kaylin approach with the same steady attention he'd had from the start. "Your mother's name is Celine," Kaylin said. Something moved through the boy's face, not surprise exactly, but the recognition of a confirmation he'd been waiting for. "Yes," he said. "You knew. I found the papers. Some of them had her name." A pause. "She never said it out loud, but I knew. Why didn't you tell me that before?" Orion was quiet for a moment. "I wanted to know if you already knew," he said finally. "Whether you'd say it yourself or wait for me to say it first." He looked at Kaylin with those gray-green eyes. "You said it. 7 years old." Kaylin stood with that for a moment. "Orion. The people my lieutenant sent to find her, they found sign of her camp, but she was gone before they arrived." He watched the boy's face carefully. "She ran because she knew you were coming in here." The boy's hands pressed flat against his knees again. "She won't go far," he said. "She never goes far. She moves when she thinks we're in danger. She finds somewhere else." A pause. "She's been doing it my whole life." "Running." "Moving," the boy corrected with a precision that felt like a defended distinction. "She always had a plan. She always had somewhere safe to go. She never ran scared. She moved smart." He met Kaylin's eyes. "She's not afraid of you." "How do you know?" "Because if she was afraid of you, she would have left before the summit. She knew about this gathering. She's known for weeks. She had time to go somewhere far. She didn't." He paused. She came close. She let me come close. Another pause, quieter. I don't think she came for the summit. I think she came because I think she wanted... He stopped. Say it, Kaylin said, the same words he'd used before. The boy's jaw worked for a moment. I think she wanted me to know you weren't dead, he said. I think she wanted me to know you were real. She wasn't ready for me to walk in the door. Kaylin stood in the silence of the emptied hall, with the torches burning low and the smell of old stone and 12 bloodlines still hanging in the air, and looked at his son. At this 7-year-old who had crossed whatever distance alone, had walked into the most politically dangerous room in the Northern Territories, had looked the Alpha King in the face and detonated 7 years of lies without flinching, and felt something in the fortified structure of himself develop a crack that no amount of building higher or harder was going to address. I need you to stay here tonight, Kaylin said. Under guard. You'll be safe. I know, Orion said. Do you? Yes. Simple. Certain. You smell like me. You wouldn't let anything happen to something that smells like you. A pause, and something in his face that was almost but not quite a child's version of a rueful expression. My mother told me that, about alphas. She said it was the one thing I could count on. Kaylin's throat was doing something he was not going to address in this hall. He turned away and found Drace waiting at the edge of the room. The roads, Kaylin said, walking toward him. Tell me what the trackers found. Northwestern route, Drace said, his voice low. She's not traveling fast. Tracker thinks she stopped within 2 miles, in the Holofen wood. He hesitated. There's something else. There's always something else today. One of Hartwell's men found something else outside the village. A second traveling party, not hers. Moving in from the east roughly 6 hours behind her timetable. Drace kept his voice level and careful. The trackers identified Ashmore Elder Council sigil markers on their gear. The crack in the structure deepened. Elder Council, Kaylin said. Yes. Moving toward her position. Moving toward the village. Before the boy walked in. Before anyone here knew what was happening. Kaylin was already turning, already calling to Petra across the hall, his hand going to the blade at his hip, not with threat, but with the deep reflex of a man whose instincts had just told him the shape of the trap. The Elder Council had sent someone, not to the summit, not to him. Moving toward the village where his son had just revealed himself to every alpha in the northern realm. Moving toward the Holofen wood, where a woman named Celine Voss was hiding within 2 miles of the only man who could expose what they'd spent 7 years burying. They already knew, they'd always known, and they were moving to make sure it stayed buried. Petra, Kaylin said, his voice carrying across the hall. Get the horses. She was already moving. The horses were ready before Petra had finished saddling the second one. Kaylin came through the side door of the Thornwall Hall at a pace that wasn't quite running. Running sent a signal he wasn't prepared to send to 12 alphas and their seconds watching from the adjacent hall windows. But it was close. Drace fell in beside him on the left, Petra on the right, 3 more of his guard behind. The village square outside was settling into the gray midday light of an overcast northern autumn, and it smelled like wood smoke and coming rain. How far ahead is the Elder Council party? Kaylin asked. 4 hours, maybe 5, Drace said. If they stopped to confirm the boy's location after he walked into the hall, and they would have, they'd want to know what happened, then we've cut that lead in half. They have riders? 6. And they're armed past what you'd send for a simple retrieval. Kaylin mounted without answering. He knew what you sent 6 armed riders for, and it wasn't to bring someone home. They moved out through the village's eastern gate and north toward the Holofen wood at a pace that was fast enough to cover ground and careful enough to keep the horses sound. The trail out of the village was packed dirt turning to softer ground as the tree line closed in around them, birch and ash giving way to the denser black pine that gave the Holofen its name. The light dropped and went greenish, and the air took on the cold, specific smell of standing water not far off. Kaylin rode and thought about 7 years. He thought about the 3 Elder Council witnesses who had identified her body, Aldrich, Severn, and Dane. 2 of them were still alive. He had spoken with Aldrich as recently as 3 months ago at a territorial review, had sat across a table from the man and listened to his recommendations on border security and grain allocation, had looked at his face and seen nothing in it but the familiar features of an elder he'd known his entire adult life. A man who had watched him grow up. A man who had served his father. A man who had looked at him and said, 7 years ago, we found her in the wetlands, and Kalen had taken that sentence into his body and built his life around it. The crack in the structure of himself that had started in the hall was now something larger. Not collapse, he didn't allow collapse, but the kind of damage that changed what a structure could hold. He felt it in his jaw, which was tight in a way that was starting to ache, and in his hands on the reins, which were controlled and still and doing more work than reins usually required. He didn't let himself think about Orion's face. Not yet. He'd put that in a container and sealed it, and he would open it when there was room, when the immediate problem was resolved. When he was somewhere that wasn't a saddle, moving through darkening trees toward a woman who had spent 7 years running from people he had trusted with his life. Petra rode up beside him. Tracker says the trail branches at the Hollowfin Fork. One route goes deeper into the wood, longer, harder ground, better for staying hidden. The other cuts northwest toward the old mill road. She'd take the wood route, Kalen said. Why? Because the mill road is faster. She knows that. She also knows anyone who knows her would know she'd take the faster road if she was running scared. A beat. She doesn't run scared. She moves smart. He heard his own words and recognized whose voice they were paraphrasing. Take the wood route. Petra dropped back. The hollow fen wood deepened around them. The trees here were old. Not ancient, not the kind of old that had names and stories attached, but old enough that their roots had buckled the ground into irregular ridges, and their canopy was dense enough that the overcast sky above had disappeared behind interlocking branches. The horses picked their way carefully. Sound carried differently in here, flattened and absorbed, so that the snap of a branch 20 feet away arrived with the same weight as one directly underfoot. Kalen heard the voices before he saw the camp. 2 voices. No, 3. 2 adults, 1 child. Low and rapid, the tone of people in the middle of an argument that had started before these particular words. He raised a fist. The party stopped. He dismounted, handed his reins to Drace without looking at him, and moved forward on foot through the underbrush. The voices became clearer. A woman's voice, low and controlled, and doing a specific kind of work. The work of keeping calm under pressure. The deliberate calm of someone who had practiced it until it became second nature. Orion is not here. I told you. The boy walked into the hall an hour ago. A man's voice. Flat. Professional in a way that had nothing to do with any official function. Every alpha in the Northern Territories saw him. Then you already have what you came for. Her voice didn't waver. There's nothing left here that requires your attention. The Elder Council sees it differently. Kalen moved through the last line of brush and saw them. The camp was minimal. A fire pit that had been recently kicked out, 2 packs on the ground, a single horse tied to a birch tree. 3 of the Elder Council's riders stood in a loose formation around a woman who was standing with her back to a thick pine. And even from here, even across 10 yards of forest floor and 7 years, Kalen knew her. She was thinner. That was the first thing, the unavoidable physical fact. Her face had sharpened in ways it hadn't had before. The softness of her 20s replaced by something more economical, like a knife that had been sharpened past the point of decoration. Her hair was darker now, or perhaps it was just the light, pulled back in a practical knot. She was wearing the same kind of clothing Orion had been wearing, simple, worn, functional. She looked like someone who had spent 7 years being difficult to remember. She hadn't seen him yet. Her attention was entirely on the 3 men in front of her. One of them had his hand on the short blade at his belt. Not drawn. Not yet. Kalen stepped out of the trees. "Remove your hand from that blade," he said. The 3 men turned. The one with his hand on the blade, younger, mid-30s, the particular build of someone who had been selected for capability rather than judgment, went through 4 distinct things in rapid succession: surprise, threat assessment, recognition, and then the very specific calculation of someone who understood exactly whose authority he was currently inside, and was deciding whether his orders were worth what ignoring it would cost. His hand came away from the blade. Celine had gone completely still. Kalen didn't look at her yet. He looked at the three men, who were rearranging their understanding of the situation with the speed of people who had expected a clear objective and arrived to find it substantially complicated. "Who sent you?" Kalen said. Not a question. The youngest one, the one who'd had his hand on the blade, looked at the other two. The oldest of the three, gray at the temples, a face that had learned to give away nothing, stepped forward. "Elder Aldrich authorized this party," the gray-templed man said. "Aldrich." The word landed flat. "And what were Aldrich's instructions?" A pause. "To secure the situation." "Secure it how?" Another pause. Longer. The gray-templed man was doing that calculation too. How much to say? What saying it would commit him to? What not saying it would cost when Kalen went back to Aldrich and compared stories? The man was not stupid. He could see the math. "To ensure the matter remained contained," the man said finally. "Contained," Kalen repeated. "The boy's public appearance complicated—" "What were Aldrich's instructions?" Kalen said again, and this time his voice had the specific register that he reserved for moments when the warning was the last one. The gray-templed man looked at him for one more second, then carefully, "To ensure the woman did not have the opportunity to be questioned by the Summit Alphas." "Ensure how?" Silence. "Leave," Kalen said. "All three of you. Your horses are behind you. You have a 1-hour lead before I send my own riders after you, and in that hour I would strongly recommend covering as much ground between yourself and Aldrich as possible, because the conversation I have with him tonight is not going to be one he enjoys, and proximity to him at that point will not serve your interests." He held the gray-templed man's gaze. "I don't give the same offer twice." The three men left. They went quickly and with the particular efficiency of people who have spent their careers assessing situations and know when one is finished. The sound of their horses faded into the wood. Kalen turned. Celine was still against the pine. She hadn't moved during the entire exchange. She was watching him with an expression that he couldn't read, not because it was blank, but because it was layered in a way he didn't have the context for. 7 years of context, he had not been present for sitting in her face like sediment in still water. Neither of them spoke for a moment. "Where is Orion?" she said finally. "In the hall. Under guard. He's safe." Something in her shoulders. Not relief. Not exactly. But the slight reduction of one specific tension while every other one remained. "You went after him," she said. "He came to me." "I know, She stopped. Her jaw tightened. "I told him to wait. He told me." A pause. "He also told me you taught him that believing something doesn't make it true." Kalen watched her face. Seems he took the lesson seriously. Something moved through her expression, complicated, fast, gone before he could name it. "Why are you here?" she said. "You could have sent riders. You came yourself." "Because 3 of Aldrich's men arrived before my riders did." He held her gaze. "And because I needed to know if what that child said to me in front of 12 alphas was the truth." "You already know it's the truth. I know what my instincts tell me. I'm asking you." Celine looked at him. The pine at her back and the dim hollow-fin light and 7 years between them, and she looked at him the way she used to look at him when she was deciding whether a thing was worth the energy it would cost to say it. "Yes," she said. "He's yours." Kalen had known it since the moment the scent hit him in the hall. He had known it through every minute of the summit session and the ride through the wood. He had known it the way you know the ground is under your feet, not as something you verify, but as something that structures everything else. But hearing it said out loud, in her voice, in the hollow fen wood with the smell of kicked-out ash and rain coming, was a different thing entirely. He breathed through it. 4 counts, even. "They told me you were dead," he said. "I know." 3 witnesses. Aldrich chose well, men who understood what they were being asked to do and why it served their interests. Her voice was level, but there was something beneath the level, Not grief exactly, but the residue of grief, the place where grief had been and had burned down to something harder. By the time I understood what had happened, I was already gone. If I'd come back, she stopped. If I'd come back, Orion would have been born inside Ashmore territory, with the Elder Council waiting. I would have protected you. You were 3 territories away fighting a war, she said, not unkindly. And the people who had decided I needed to disappear were inside your walls. Your protection required you to know who the threat was. You didn't. He had no answer for that. It was accurate, and it landed like accuracy always landed, without softness, without apology. Why now? He said. Why come to the summit? You had to know the risk. Celine was quiet for a moment. In the trees overhead, something moved, a bird settling, small branches flexing. Orion is 7, she said. When I was running, the first years, when he was small, I could frame it. I could make our life make sense to him in a way that didn't require the parts I was leaving out. A pause. He's not small anymore. He asks questions I can't answer without lying, and I am... She looked at the kicked-out fire pit rather than at Kaylin. I am very tired of lying to my son. So you brought him close. I thought if he saw you, if he saw the summit, the territory, the reality of it, maybe he'd understand without me having to... She stopped again. I miscalculated how much of you is already in him. He walked in there alone. He walked in there alone, she confirmed, and her voice did something on those words that she controlled quickly and thoroughly, the way you controlled something that could not be allowed to surface in the current terrain. Kaylin looked at her for a long moment. The woman who had been his mate. The woman who had been dead for 7 years. The woman who had raised his son in hiding, alone, running, teaching a child to listen and move smart and understand that believing something doesn't make it true. He had spent 7 years fortifying, building higher and harder and less permeable. He was standing in a forest watching everything he'd built get its foundations examined. You can't go back to wherever you came from, he said. Not now. The Summit Alphas know about Orion. Aldrich's people know you're here. If I ride away and leave you in this wood, you have maybe 6 hours before someone else finds you. He held her gaze. I'm not riding away. I don't need you to... This isn't about what you need from me, he said. This is about the fact that my elder council staged my mate's death, hid my son, and just sent 3 armed men into this wood with instructions to ensure you couldn't be questioned. His voice stayed even. The evenness cost something. This is about the fact that I trusted Aldrich for 12 years, and he has been managing my kingdom around a lie that touches my bloodline, my line of succession, and my son. A pause. Whatever you need or don't need from me, Celine, this is no longer only about you. She held his gaze. Her own jaw was tight now, matching his. Orion doesn't know you, she said. I know. He knows the idea of you, the version I... She stopped, something shifting in her face. The version I gave him is incomplete, deliberately incomplete. I understand. He's going to be angry. Yes. Not just at me, at everything. He collects information, and then he's quiet with it for a long time, and then he... She paused. He has your jaw when he's angry. Something happened in Kaylin's chest that he was not going to address in the Holofen wood. Come back to the hall, he said. Both of you are under my protection until I've addressed the council. After that, he stopped. There was no clear architecture for what came after that. There was no protocol, no precedent he could pull from 12 years of territorial governance for any of the sentences that needed to follow. After that, we figure out the rest. Celine looked at him for a long moment. The space between them was full of things that had no business being left in a forest, things that required rooms and time, and the kind of conversations that couldn't happen while 3 of Aldrich's riders were somewhere ahead on the road back to Ashmore territory. Orion will want to know why I ran, she said finally. Tell him the truth. The full truth is going to change what he thinks of a lot of people. He deserves it anyway. She held his gaze, breathed. Something in her expression that wasn't quite agreement and wasn't quite surrender. The look of someone who has been carrying a structure alone for so long that the offer of another set of hands requires a moment of recalibration before it can be accepted. "All right," she said. They rode back through the Hollowfen Wood as the first rain began, a thin, cold rain that came through the canopy in irregular drops and darkened the pine needles black. Celine rode her own horse. She had not accepted a hand up, had mounted alone with the efficiency of someone who had been doing everything alone for 7 years and had the reflexes to prove it. Kaylin rode beside her and didn't push for conversation, and she didn't offer it, and the space between them held all the words that weren't ready yet with the kind of pressure that precedes weather. They came out of the tree line into the village with the Thornwall Hall's torches visible through the rain, and Drace rode up alongside. "Hartwell's been asking for you," Drace said. "He can wait." "He's not the only one." Marek sent a message. The Coldwater twins jointly, first time in 6 years apparently, also sent a message. About the boy. About the boy, the bloodline question, and the apparent implication that the Ashmore Elder Council has been operating in a way that... Drace's voice stayed flat and professional. "That raises certain questions about the stability of Ashmore leadership and the validity of decisions made under potentially compromised council." Kaylin absorbed this without reacting. He had known it was coming. The moment Orion walked into that hall, the political architecture of the Northern Territories had shifted in ways that wouldn't finish shifting for weeks. Every alpha at that summit had just been given a lever. Not a weapon, not yet, but a lever. And people with levers used them. He dismounted in the square and looked up at the Thornwall Hall's entrance and thought about what was waiting inside it. Orion, with his flat hands and his gray-green eyes and 7 years of questions. Hartwell, with his carefully held intelligence and his political positioning. 12 alphas calculating the value of what they'd witnessed today. And somewhere, riding hard toward Ashmore territory, 3 riders carrying news that would reach Aldrich before morning. "Send word to Ashmore," he said to Drace. "Nobody enters or leaves the Elder Council chambers until I return. If Aldrich attempts to move..." He stopped. "Yes?" Drace said. "If Aldrich attempts to move," Kaylin said quietly, "remind him that the last man who ran from me in this territory didn't finish the trip." Drace nodded and moved off. Kaylin looked at Celine, who had dismounted and was standing in the rain with the particular stillness of someone who had learned to become invisible in public spaces. She was watching the hall entrance. "He'll hear your voice," Kaylin said, "before you're through the door. His hearing is..." "I know what his hearing is," she said. Not harshly, just accurate. "I've been living with it for 7 years." Kaylin nodded. They walked through the entrance together, and the door opened onto the main corridor where Toran was stationed at the inner hall door, and before either of them had taken 3 steps inside, a child's voice came through the thick oak of the inner door, not calling out, not in distress, just steady and certain, the way it had been steady and certain across the council table an hour ago. "She's here," Orion said from the other side of the door. Not a question. A fact he had registered before either of them had announced themselves, before any door had opened. From 15 feet away, in a sealed room, registered and stated, the way someone states a thing they have been waiting a very long time to be true. Celine's hand, at her side, closed briefly into a fist and then opened. Torin looked at Kaylin. Kaylin nodded. The guard opened the door. Orion was standing in the center of the hall. Not at the chair against the wall where Kaylin had left him. He had moved to the center, which meant he had heard them in the corridor and walked to meet the midpoint. He looked at his mother, and his mother looked at him, and 7 years of careful architecture trembled in the air between them. Then he looked past her, at Kaylin, and the expression on his face was the expression of someone who has arrived at the moment they spent a long time preparing for and found, in the actual arrival, that no preparation was sufficient. "You came after her," he said. "Yes," Kaylin said, "because of what I said in the hall." "Because of what you said in the hall," Kaylin confirmed. Orion looked at his mother again. His jaw had that tight quality. His hands were flat at his sides, the same gesture, the same unconscious anchor. "You were going to run," he said. Celine looked at her son. "Yes," she said. The same word she had given Kaylin in the forest, the same weight, the same precision. "You were always going to run," Orion said. "That was always the plan. You never..." His voice did something, quickly corrected. You didn't bring me here to meet him. You brought me here so I could see him, from a distance, and then we'd leave. Celine said nothing, which was its own answer. But you told me, Orion said, and his voice had gone quieter now, the quiet of something that had stopped looking for a way to stay contained. You told me that the truth lasts longer than anything. That's what you always said. The truth outlasts everything. He held her gaze with those gray-green eyes that were Kaylin's eyes in the face of a child who had not yet learned to seal things in containers. And you were going to let me leave here with half of it. Celine closed her eyes for exactly 2 seconds. When she opened them, something had changed in her face. Not broken, not undone, but altered. The way a door that has been locked for a long time changes when the key finally turns. You're right, she said. Orion stared at her. He had not, Kaylin observed, expected that. You are completely right, Celine said. And she stopped. I owe you the rest of it. All of it. Tonight. The hall was very quiet. The torches burned. Rain moved against the high stone windows. Orion looked at his mother for a long moment. Then he looked at Kaylin. Then back at Celine. All of it, he said. Not a question this time either. All of it, she said. And that was the moment Kaylin understood that whatever came next, Aldrich and the Elder Council and 12 alphas with their levers and the entire collapsing structure of 7 years of managed lies was going to be built or destroyed on the foundation of whatever Celine told her son in the next few hours. Whatever full truth she had been carrying alone through 7 years of moving smart and staying hidden. The truth that had not yet finished arriving. From the corridor behind them, Drace's voice fast and low. Kaylin, he turned. Drace was in the doorway, his face carrying the particular quality that Kaylin had learned to read as not bad news exactly, but news that changed the shape of everything. Ryder just came in from Ashmore, Drace said. Hard ride. Left before dawn. What does the message say? Aldrich is gone, Drace said. Cleared out of the Elder Council chambers last night. Him and Elder Severn both. A pause. And they took the archive records with them. All of them. 7 years of council documentation, bloodline registry, territorial agreements. Drace held his gaze. The entire record of every decision made under your authority is gone. The word gone sat in the air of the Thornwall Hall corridor, like a stone dropped into still water, and Kaylin watched the ripples move outward through everything he thought he had understood about the shape of his own kingdom. Gone. Not fled in panic, not scattered by surprise. Gone with precision, cleared out before dawn, before the summit even convened, before Orion walked into the hall and detonated the morning. Which meant Aldrich had not reacted to what happened today. Aldrich had anticipated it, had known, with the particular confidence of a man who understood the mechanisms he'd built, that eventually something would move toward the surface, and had spent time he'd had in abundance making sure that when it did, the evidence that could be used against him would not be in the same room. 12 years. Kaylin stood in the corridor with Drace's words still settling and thought about 12 years of Elder Council sessions. 12 years of documentation that he had signed and reviewed and trusted. 12 years of a record that was supposed to be the architecture of his authority. Bloodline registry, territorial agreements, succession documentation. The paper bones of everything that made Ashmore Pack into a functioning power rather than a collection of wolves with a common ancestor. All of it in Aldrich's hands now. All of it, which meant Aldrich could do one of two things. Destroy it, which removed the evidence of what he'd done, but also removed the operational foundation of the pack, or use it, which meant leverage. Leverage against Kaylin, against Celine, against a 7-year-old boy whose existence had just been made public in front of every alpha in the Northern Realm. He turned back into the hall. Celine was watching him with the expression of someone who had just had a suspicion confirmed that they had hoped would not be confirmed. Orion was watching him with the expression of someone who was processing multiple things simultaneously and choosing, very deliberately, not to speak yet. Aldrich and Severn, Kaylin said. Both gone. Celine's jaw tightened. And Dane? Drace, still in the doorway, looked at Kaylin. Kalen nodded at him. Dre said, Elder Dane was found in his quarters this morning. Asile. The writer says he won't speak to anyone but Alpha Ashmore directly. Then he's scared, Selene said. Scared of what? Kalen said, not directing it at her specifically, directing it at the room, at the shape of what was assembling itself out of the pieces arriving one after another. Scared of what Aldrich and Severn left behind, Selene said. Her voice was careful now, specific, the voice of someone who had spent 7 years thinking about this and was finally in a room where saying it out loud served a purpose. Dane was the weakest of the three. He identified my body because he was told to, but he didn't. She paused, choosing. He didn't understand the full scope of it. He thought it was a succession matter, a temporary measure. He thought I would be compensated, relocated, that eventually, her jaw tightened. He spent 7 years finding out what eventually actually looked like. He knew you were alive, Kalen said. He knew enough. She met his eyes. He knew enough to be useful to Aldrich, and not enough to feel clean about it. Kalen looked at Drace. Get a rider back to Ashmore tonight. Dane doesn't leave his quarters, and nobody enters them until I arrive. Nobody. Not pack guard, not council staff, not anyone operating under elder authority. The council staff will push back on that. Then push back harder. He held Drace's gaze. The Elder Council's authority is suspended as of this moment. All of it. Every operational decision goes through Petra until I return. Drace absorbed this without expression. It was not a small thing. Suspending Elder Council authority without formal pack assembly and documentation was the kind of action that rewrote the power structure of a pack and invited every territorial neighbor to recalculate their risk assessments. Kalen knew that. He also knew that every hour he waited was an hour Aldrich used, and Aldrich had a head start in the archives. Yes, sir, Drace said, and moved back into the corridor. Kalen turned to Petra, who had been stationed by the hall's inner door since they returned from the wood. We leave at first light. The summit session, she said. Not as an objection, as a variable requiring assessment. The summit session continues without me. He looked at her steadily. Hartwell already knows more than he should. Keep him in conversations. He'll stay if there's still something to negotiate. Marek will stay as long as Hartwell stays. The Coldwater twins are already in the middle of something with each other, and this hall is neutral ground, so they'll stay. He paused. The summit continues. It just doesn't need me in it. Petra nodded once. He looked at Selene. You'll ride with us at first light. She met his eyes. There was a moment, brief, the length of a decision being made. Yes, she said. He looked at Orion. The boy was watching him with those gray-green eyes that had already seen too much today and were still taking things in, still filing, still building the internal architecture of a child who had walked into a storm and intended to understand every piece of it before he stopped. You'll ride with us too, Kalen said. Orion looked at his mother. She nodded. He looked back at Kalen. I want to hear everything, he said. What Dane says. All of it. Orion, Selene started. All of it, the boy said again, and the quality of his voice left very little room for the sentence to go anywhere else. You said tonight, the full truth. Selene held his gaze for a long moment. Then she said, tonight. The rain came down harder against the high windows, and the torches burned, and the Thornwall Hall held all of its silence around 3 people who were learning the shape of what they were to each other in the middle of the wreckage of what had been done to all of them. They rode for Ashmore at dawn. The route was 8 hours on good roads, and the roads were not good. The autumn rains had softened the packed dirt of the main territorial road into something that slowed the horses and demanded constant attention. Kalen rode at the front. Selene rode behind him to his left. Orion rode beside his mother, which he had established without discussion by positioning his horse there when they mounted in the village square, and nobody had suggested otherwise. They didn't speak much in the first hours. The landscape moved around them, the northern scrubland giving way to the rockier terrain of the mid-territories, the gray sky pressing down flat and close. Kalen watched the road and the tree lines and thought about Aldrich. 12 years. He kept returning to that number the way a tongue returns to a broken tooth, not because there was anything useful in the returning, but because the damage was there and the body needed to account for it. 12 years of a man at his counsel table. 12 years of advice received and trusted. 12 years of decisions made on foundations that had been quietly, methodically hollowed out from underneath. The thing about betrayal that no one told you, the thing that couldn't be prepared for regardless of how many times you'd witnessed it in others, was not the fact of it. It was the retroactive quality of it, the way it reached backward through every prior interaction and rewrote the meaning. Every session, every strategic discussion, every moment Aldrich had leaned across the table with the considered expression of a man offering his best thinking, all of it was now a different document. All of it had to be reread. 12 years of a different document. He had built his authority on information. He had prided himself, quietly and without announcing it, on understanding the room better than anyone else in it, on reading hands and postures and the specific weight of pauses. He had sat across from every alpha in the Northern Realm and extracted intelligence from the gap between what they said and what they meant. And he had used it, and it had worked, and he had trusted the competence of his own perception. And Aldrich had sat across from him for 12 years, and Kaelin had read nothing. Either Aldrich was better at it than anyone Kaelin had ever faced, or Kaelin had never truly been looking, had never applied to his own table the same scrutiny he applied to everyone else's, because his own table was supposed to be safe ground, supposed to be already known. That was the cost of trust. Not the betrayal itself, the foreclosure of scrutiny that trust required. You could not trust and watch simultaneously. They were incompatible. And he had chosen trust because he had believed the choice was justified. He had been wrong. He rode that understanding through 8 hours of bad road and gray sky and said nothing about it, and it settled into him the way cold settled into old wounds, deep, permanent, a new baseline. They arrived at Ashmore Pack territory at late afternoon, the main settlement coming into view through the tree line in the particular way it always did on this approach. First the high watchtower, then the smoke from the central fires, then the outline of the main hall against the ridge. Home. Kaelin looked at it and felt the word apply, and simultaneously felt the word become more complicated than it had ever been. Petra had sent riders ahead. The pack was aware, not of the details, but of the shape of it. The Elder Council chambers were sealed. The perimeter guard had doubled. The population of the settlement, roughly 300 wolves in the central area and another 100 spread across the outlying territories, was in the kind of suspended state that groups of people fell into when they understood that something was wrong at the structural level but didn't yet know the form it would take. Kaelin rode through the main gate and felt every pair of eyes in the settlement find him and hold. He had ridden through this gate hundreds of times. He had never felt the weight of it like this. Not the weight of authority, which he had carried so long it was structural, but the weight of what authority was built on. The eyes watching him were the eyes of people whose bloodline records were gone, whose pack agreements were gone, whose settled understanding of who they were in relation to everyone else was sitting in Aldrich's hands somewhere in the Northern Territories, being used as a tool or being burned into ash. He dismounted in the central yard and handed his reins off without looking and walked directly toward the Elder Council wing. Celine dismounted behind him. She stood in the yard of the place she had last been 7 years ago, as a different person with a different life ahead of her. And she did not look at it the way someone looks at a homecoming. She looked at it the way she had looked at the riders in the Hall of Fenwood, with clear eyes and no excess feeling, the assessment of someone cataloging what was present and what was dangerous, and what required immediate attention. Orion dismounted and stood beside her. He looked at everything. He looked at the yard and the main hall and the watchtower and the faces of the pack members standing at careful distances. He looked the way he always looked, steadily, filing, not performing anything for anyone watching. Then he looked at the Elder Council wing, and something in his face tightened in a way that Kaelin, already walking away, didn't see. Elder Dane was in the second room of the council wing, which was a working room rather than a formal chamber. Plain table, 4 chairs, a fire that someone had thought to build up, a small window that looked out on the inner yard. He was 63 years old, and he looked, when Kaelin pushed open the door, like a man who had aged past 63 in the preceding 24 hours. His face was the color of cold ash. His hands on the table were folded and still with the rigid stillness of someone controlling a tremor. He looked at Kaelin. His eyes moved to Celine, who had come through the door behind Kaelin and stopped just inside it. Whatever color had remained in Dane's face left. "She's alive," he said. The words were barely sound. "Sit down, Dane," Kaelin said. I knew she was—" He stopped. His folded hands tightened against each other. "Aldrich said she'd been moved somewhere safe. I thought—" "You didn't think," Kaelin said. He pulled out the chair across from Dane and sat down, and his voice was quiet in the register that meant the quiet was doing a great deal of work. "You chose. Those are different things, and right now the difference matters." Dane looked at him. The old man's eyes were doing something complicated. Guilt and fear occupying the same space in a combination that was curdling toward desperation. "Tell me what you knew," Kaelin said. "From the beginning. All of it." Dane breathed, a long, unsteady breath, and then he started to talk. He talked for a long time. The structure of it was not what Kaelin had expected, and it was worse than what Kaelin had expected, which was a combination he had not been prepared for. He had expected ambition, straightforward ambition, an heir buying elder support to clear the path to succession. That was the story Kaelin had been building in his head since the Hollowfen Wood, the story he had been preparing to dismantle. Ambitious heir, corrupted elders, a woman removed from the board as a tactical maneuver. It was not that. It was colder than that. There was no specific heir. There was no single orchestrating ambition. There was instead a coalition, 4 elders, 3 of them now gone, and 1 sitting across this table, who had looked at Kaelin 7 years ago and seen an alpha who was becoming something they had not contracted for when they'd supported his ascension. An alpha who was consolidating authority too effectively, who was reducing elder council influence too systematically, who had taken a mate outside the council's approved candidates and was building a power structure that would, within a generation, make the elder council functionally irrelevant. Celine had not been removed because of who she was. She had been removed because of what she represented. An alpha operating outside elder control, choosing his own mate, building his own alliances, accumulating the kind of sovereign authority that left no room for intermediaries. The elders had not been protecting the pack from Kaelin. They had been protecting their own position from an alpha who was good enough at his job that he didn't need them anymore. And the lie had been the mechanism. Her disappearance, her death, had destabilized him in ways that had pushed him back toward needing the council's structure. Not because he had been weak, but because grief and loss and the absence of a trusted partner had created gaps that the council had quietly, efficiently filled, had made themselves necessary again. They had manufactured his dependence by destroying the thing that had made him independent. Kaelin sat with this for a long time after Dane stopped talking. The fire burned. Celine stood against the wall with her arms at her sides and her face holding something that had gone past anger into a register that had no clean name. The expression of someone who has spent 7 years believing the thing done to them was at least logical, at least explicable in terms of power and succession and ambition, and has just found out it was smaller than that, more venal, more ordinary. They had taken everything from her not because she was a threat, because she was useful as an absence. "The archives," Kaelin said. "Aldrich took them." "Yes," Dane's voice was scraped. He'd been preparing for this contingency for years. He knew that eventually, he said it himself. He said no mechanism survives contact with time forever. He had a plan for when it surfaced. "Where did he go?" Dane looked at his folded hands. "He has allies in the Eastern Territories. Pack called the Greyveil. They've had an arrangement for—" He stopped, recalculated. "For as long as I've been aware of the Council's operations outside your knowledge." "Greyveil Pack," Kaelin said. "Alpha there is a man named Torith. He and Aldrich have a history that predates your father's tenure. Old debt? Old alliance?" Dane looked up. "Torith has no love for Ashmore territorial expansion. If Aldrich brings him the archives, Torith can use them to challenge every agreement Ashmore Pack has made in the past 12 years, Kaelin said. "Every border, every alliance, every succession document." He held Dane's gaze. "Our pack's legal standing in half the territorial disputes we've resolved becomes contestable." "Yes." Celine pushed off the wall. She walked to the table and she looked at Dane with the steady, clear attention of someone who has been waiting a very long time for a room like this one. "The witnesses to my death," she said. "Aldrich, Severn, you. 3 signatures on the identification record." Her voice was level and specific and left no space for anything that wasn't a direct answer. "Where's the original identification record?" Dane looked at her. "Aldrich took it with the archives." "Is there a copy?" A pause. "There was, in the secondary records chamber. Aldrich would have—" He stopped. Something moved through his face, not quite hope, too hollowed out for that, but the look of someone who has realized they might have something left to offer. "I don't believe he would have known about the secondary chamber. It was established by your father's council, before Aldrich's tenure. Some records were duplicated there as a safeguard. I don't know if the identification record is among them, but—" "Where is it?" Kaelin said. "Behind the old grain assessment office. East wall of the original settlement. It hasn't been accessed in I don't know how long." Kaelin stood. "Petra," he said, without raising his voice, knowing she was positioned outside the door and had been throughout. The door opened. "Sir?" "Secondary records chamber, east wall, take 2 and go now." Petra moved. Kaelin looked at Dane. The old man's face was folded in on itself, the specific collapse of someone who has been carrying a structure that has just been condemned. He was not going to run. He didn't have enough left for running. "You'll give a full accounting," Kaelin said. "Everything you know about the council's operations outside my authority. Every name, every arrangement, every exchange. You'll give it in writing, and you'll give it tonight." "Yes," Dane said, barely audible. "And Dane." Kaelin waited until the old man looked up at him. "If there is a single piece of what you tell me tonight that I later find to be incomplete or adjusted, a single name missing, a single arrangement softened, you will not have the opportunity to adjust it again. Do you understand me?" "Yes," Dane said. "Then start writing." Kaelin left the room and closed the door behind him. He stood in the corridor for 4 breaths, the same 4 breaths he'd taken in the dark passage at Thornwall Hall, the same discipline, the same container, and then he turned and found Celine standing 2 feet away. She had followed him out. She was watching him with the gray-green eyes that their son had inherited, and in the corridor's dim torchlight, her face held the particular quality of someone who is about to say a thing they have been carrying alone long enough that they are no longer able to carry it in silence. "I want to see Orion," she said, "before anything else happens tonight." "Where is he?" Kaelin asked. "He went with one of your guard to the east yard. He said he wanted to see the territory." Kaelin was quiet for a moment. He thought about a 7-year-old boy standing in the east yard of Ashmore Pack Settlement, looking at the territory that was his bloodline inheritance, that had been kept from him by the same people who had kept his parents from each other. Looking at it with those flat hands and those steady eyes, filing everything. "We'll go together," he said. They found Orion in the east yard. He was standing at the yard's far edge, where the settlement's outer fence gave way to a view of the ridge and the valley below. The rain had stopped, and the last light of the afternoon was cutting through the cloud break on the horizon in the particular low autumn way that turned everything briefly gold before the gray came back. He had his hands in his pockets, which was new, a different posture than the flat hands at his sides, a posture that was less about control and more about thought. He heard them coming. He didn't turn around. He kept looking at the valley. "Dane told him everything," Orion said. Kaelin stopped. "What?" "One of the guard told me what Dane was saying, before you came out." He paused. "I asked him to tell me, and he did." Kaelin looked at his guard, a young man named Ferris, who had the expression of someone who had made a decision he wasn't entirely sure about in the moment, and was now less sure than that. Kaelin held his gaze for exactly 1 second, and Ferris looked at the ground. "It wasn't Ferris's fault," Orion said, still not turning. "I'm good at asking. My mother taught me." Celine, beside Kaelin, made a small sound that might have been a breath and might have been something else. "Orion," she said. He turned then. His face in the gold afternoon light was the face of a child who had been a child this morning and had done some irrevocable growing since. Not adult. He was 7. He would be 7 for a long time yet. But something in the alignment of his expression had shifted, the way the alignment of a young tree shifts when it has been tested by enough wind to understand the wind is real. They did it because he was getting too strong, Orion said. He looked at Kaelin. That's what Dane said. They were afraid of what you were becoming, so they took away the thing that made you... He paused, carefully. The thing that made you not need them. Kaelin held his son's gaze. There was no useful thing to say to that. It was accurate and it was terrible. And the only thing worse than hearing it would have been letting the child stand there having heard it alone. Yes, Kaelin said. And she ran for 7 years because if she came back, they would have... Orion stopped, looked at Celine. What would they have done? Celine looked at her son. The gold light was going, the gray coming back, the valley below the fence line going darker and quieter. I didn't know exactly, she said. I knew it would be something that made it permanent, something that made sure neither of us could be used to reach you. Orion held her gaze for a long moment. His jaw had that tight quality. His hands had come out of his pockets and were flat at his sides again. Okay, he said. Finally, quietly. A word that wasn't agreement or acceptance, but the sound of a person deciding that what has been received, and that falling down under it is not an available option. Then, from behind them, from the direction of the main hall, Petra's voice, hard and fast. Kaelin. He turned. She was crossing the yard at a pace that wasn't running, but was everything running was except the name. Secondary records chamber, she said. She was holding something in her hand, a document wrapped in oilcloth, old and dark at the edges. We found the identification record. He took it, unwrapped it. The oilcloth came away stiff, and the document inside was yellowed at the edges but legible, ink still dark, signatures intact, 3 names at the bottom in the formal hand of Elder Council authentication. Aldrich's signature, Severn's, Dane's, the identification record for the body of Celine Voss, recovered from the northern wetlands, confirmed deceased, dated 7 years ago, proof. Not of Celine's death, proof of the lie. Proof of 3 elder signatures on a document that attested to something they knew was false, that had been used to dismantle the authority of an alpha and take a woman's life from her and hide a child from his father. Proof. If Kaelin could get it in front of the Summit Alphas before Aldrich reached Toreth in the Eastern Territories. He looked at Petra. How fast can we get back to Thornwall? Hard ride. 4 hours if we push. Summit session ends day after tomorrow, Kaelin said. If Aldrich reaches Toreth, and Toreth brings the archives to the summit as a challenge before we arrive, we lose the ground, Petra said. 12 alphas watch an archive challenge in open session, and the question of Celine's status and Orion's legitimacy becomes a contested matter instead of a settled one. Yes. Celine had come up beside him. She looked at the document in his hands. Her face in the gray returning light was the face of someone holding very still over something that wants to break. That document is the foundation, she said. But it's not enough on its own. Aldrich will say it's fabricated. He has the archives. He controls the paper record. She looked at Kaelin. You need a witness who isn't Dane. Someone who isn't inside Ashmore's sphere. Someone the Summit Alphas will accept as independent. Hartwell, Kaelin said. Celine held his gaze. You said he knew something 7 years ago. He had intelligence. He held it, used it as leverage. Which means he has documentation. She paused. An independent alpha's documentation of a bloodline matter involving Ashmore Pack, held for 7 years, corroborates the record in your hand. Aldrich can't dismiss both. Kaelin looked at the document, looked at Petra, looked at Celine, who had spent 7 years with nothing but her own intelligence and her son and the necessity of thinking several moves ahead of every threat, and had arrived at the right answer in less than a minute. He thought about what it meant to need someone. Had spent 12 years being systematically separated from the person who thought the way he thought. Had spent those 12 years wondering, occasionally and privately, why the decisions felt slightly heavier alone than they should have. Now he knew. Right ahead, he said to Petra. Get to Thornwall before the session closes tomorrow. Find Hartwell and tell him I need that intelligence in open session, not as leverage, as testimony. He held her gaze. Tell him what I'm offering in return is a clear account of how that intelligence was obtained and why it was withheld. Full transparency. On the record. Petra absorbed this. It was not a small thing either. Full transparency about Hartwell's 7-year silence would not make Hartwell look clean. But it would make him a witness rather than a conspirator, which was a considerably better position than the alternative. He'll want guarantees, Petra said. Tell him the guarantee is that if he doesn't testify and Aldrich reaches Toreth first, every alpha at that summit is going to spend the next decade managing the fallout of a corrupted archive in Greyveal hands, and his territories share 3 borders with packs who owe Ashmore outstanding agreements. Kaelin held her gaze. Tell him the guarantee is that this is the better option, and he's smart enough to know it. Petra nodded and was already turning. And Petra, he said. She stopped. If Aldrich's riders are on the eastern road, if there's any sign he's moving faster than expected, send word back immediately. His voice was level and quiet, and underneath the level there was something that had been building since the Thornwall corridor and had not finished building. I need to know if he reaches Toreth before we reach Thornwall. Petra looked at him for exactly 1 second with the expression of someone who has served a person long enough to hear the thing beneath the words. Yes, sir, she said, and moved. Kaelin stood in the east yard of his settlement with the identification record in his hands, and his son standing 10 feet away, and the woman who had been dead for 7 years standing beside him, and felt the full weight of what the next 12 hours required. He had a document. He had a frightened elder writing a confession inside. He had, possibly, a summit alpha, who would testify if the calculus favored him. He had 4 hours of hard road between himself and the only room where all of it could be presented before Aldrich moved the game to a different board. What he did not have was the archives. What he did not have was Aldrich in a room. What he did not have was any guarantee that Petra's ride would be faster than Aldrich's head start, or that Hartwell would calculate correctly, or that 12 alphas who had spent a day reassessing their territorial positions would be willing to let the truth of this matter override the political convenience of a contested outcome. He had walked into every negotiation of his adult life with better odds than this. He looked at Orion. The boy was watching him with those steady eyes in the fading light, and there was something in his expression that Kaelin did not immediately recognize, and then did. It was the expression of someone who was ready, not unafraid, not certain, ready. It was the same expression Kaelin had seen in his own reflection on the mornings before hard things, and he had not known until this moment that it was something a person could be born with. From the main hall behind them, a pack member ran into the yard, young, breathing hard, the face of someone carrying news that had been urgent for longer than it took to find its recipient. Alpha Ashmore, the young man said. Ryder just came in from the eastern road, Aldrich's party. He caught his breath. They're not going to Greyveal. The rider tracked them north. They turned north at the ridge split. North. There was nothing north of the ridge split except the Thornwall Valley. Aldrich was not running to Toreth in the east. Aldrich was riding back toward the summit, which meant Aldrich had decided that the archives weren't leverage to be used later. They were a weapon to be used now. He was in open session, in front of 12 alphas, before Kaelin could get back there, before Petra could reach Hartwell, before the identification record in Kaelin's hands could be presented by anyone who had standing to present it. Aldrich was going to walk into the Thornwall summit and collapse the foundation in public, and he was going to do it tonight. They rode north in the dark. No torches. Torches announced position, and position was the one thing they could not afford to give away. The horses moved by the dim residue of cloud-filtered moonlight, picking their way along the ridge road at a pace that was faster than safe and slower than necessary, and Kaelin rode at the front and let the cold air work on his face and thought about the distance between here and Thornwall Hall in terms of hours and what could happen inside those hours. Aldrich had a head start, not a large one. The rider's estimate put him perhaps 90 minutes ahead, possibly less if his party was managing the archives as physical cargo, which slowed horses in ways that a lightly equipped pursuit did not. But 90 minutes in a summit hall full of 12 alphas who had already spent a day recalculating their positions was enough time to do substantial damage, enough time to open the archive boxes and place documents on the table and let the assembled room draw its own conclusions before anyone arrived to complicate the narrative. Aldrich understood narrative. That was what 12 years of proximity had finally, retroactively, made clear. The man was not a soldier. He was not a power seeker in the direct territorial sense. He was a narrator, someone who had spent decades understanding that the version of events which reached people first was the version that shaped every subsequent version, and that controlling the first telling was more valuable than controlling the actual facts. He had told Kaylin his mate was dead. He had told it with witnesses and documentation and a burial, and had let time do the rest, let the accumulated weight of 7 years of unchallenged narrative become the bedrock that Kaylin built his kingdom on. Now he was writing to Thornwall to tell the Summit Alphas a different story. To tell it first, with archives as evidence, before Kaylin arrived with an identification record and Dane's confession and the living proof of Celine on horseback behind him. The first telling. Again. Kaylin pressed his horse harder and listened to the sound of hooves on the ridge road and thought about what it meant to arrive second. He had arrived second once in his career, at the Stonefen boundary negotiation 8 years ago, before Marek had consolidated. He had arrived to a room that had already been shaped by 2 hours of Marek's framing, and he had spent the next 4 hours dismantling what she'd built before he could establish anything of his own. He'd won, eventually. But it had cost him 3 territorial concessions that a first arrival would not have required. This was not a boundary negotiation. This was his legitimacy, his bloodline, his son's right to exist within the pact structure, and the standing of every agreement Ashmore had made in 12 years. The cost of arriving second here was not territorial concessions. He heard Celine's horse behind him, moving at the same pace. She hadn't spoken since they left the settlement yard. She rode the way she did everything, economically, without performance, with the full attention of someone who had learned that survival required complete presence and nothing left over for display. He had been wrong about her once, had trusted the narrative he'd been given because the alternative had been too structural to challenge. The alternative required examining the foundations, and Kaylin had been busy building on top of them. He was not going to be wrong about her again. Petra rode 2 hours ago, he said, not turning, loud enough to carry back to her over the sound of the horses. I know, Celine said. If she reached Hartwell before Aldrich arrived. If, she said. The word carried its full weight. He had no answer for the if. There were 4 of them in total on this road, himself, Celine, Drace, and Ferris, who had the decency to look useful rather than contrite about the East Yard conversation. Enough to arrive with authority, not enough to do anything about it if Aldrich had already moved. They covered the next hour in silence and cold, and the sound of horses working hard on a bad road. The Thornwall Hall's torches came visible through the trees at the valley descent, closer than Kaylin expected. They had made better time than the horses' condition had suggested was possible, which meant the horses had found something in the last hour that they hadn't started with. He slowed the approach as they came down the ridge into the valley proper, reading the settlement around the hall the way he always read new terrain, exits, concentrations of activity, the particular arrangement of lights that told you where the people were and what they were doing. Too many lights. The hall itself was lit as if a session were running. Multiple torches in the courtyard, horses tied at the post. More than had been there this morning. He counted 6 new horses and recognized the configuration of their tack, even from here. Aldrich's horses. He was already inside. Kaylin dismounted at the courtyard edge without tying his horse and moved toward the hall entrance at the pace that wasn't running. Drace fell in behind him. Celine dismounted and followed without being asked, and he heard Ferris take the reins of both their horses and stay with them, which was correct judgment without instruction. The hall entrance guard, a Thornwall neutral, not Ashmore, saw Kaylin coming and had the particular expression of a man who was glad to see an authority that was capable of resolving a thing that had gotten complicated in his absence. How long? Kaylin said. Elder Aldrich arrived 40 minutes ago, the guard said. He requested an emergency session. Alpha Hartwell convened it. Hartwell convened it, Kaylin said. He's the senior Alpha present. Hartwell, who had sent a message requesting a private word, who had held 7 years of intelligence and was now sitting inside that hall watching Aldrich open archive boxes, and had either decided his position was better served by letting it run, or had decided something else that Kaylin didn't have enough information to calculate. He pushed through the door. The hall was full. Every alpha who had been at the morning session was present, which meant nobody had left despite the day's disruptions. Either they were too interested in the outcome, or they'd understood that leaving during this particular window would look like a choice. The torches were high, and the room was warm, and the smell was different from the morning session, tighter, the specific smell of people who have been in a room long enough that their collective tension has become atmospheric. Aldrich was standing at the far end of the table. He was 71 years old, and he was standing the way men stood when they had decided that the thing they were doing was righteous, straight-backed, settled, the posture of someone who had made their peace with the cost and was past the part where doubt had purchase. In front of him on the table were 3 open document cases, and the papers that had been removed from them were arranged in the particular order of someone who had been planning this specific presentation for a long time. He saw Kalen come through the door. Nothing in his face moved. That was the thing that landed hardest. Not anger, not guilt, not the complicated expression of a man caught in a thing he had hoped to finish before the person it concerned arrived. Just stillness, the settled stillness of someone who had already accounted for this variable and had decided it didn't change the calculation. 12 years of that face across a table, 12 years of trusting a face that had been managing him the entire time. The room had gone quiet at Kalen's entrance in the way it had gone quiet for Orion that morning, and the comparison arrived in Kalen's mind without permission and settled there because it was accurate. He was walking into the same room his 7-year-old son had walked into, carrying information that would either stand or be dismantled depending on who controlled the next 10 minutes of narrative. Orion had walked in without flinching. Kalen crossed the room to the table's head. "Elder Aldrich," he said. His voice was level and quiet and doing the most work it had ever done. "Alpha Ashmore," Aldrich said. The same voice, the same register. The voice of a man in a council chamber, which was the only environment Kalen had ever heard him use and which now sounded like a costume. "You called an emergency session," Kalen said. Not to Aldrich, to Hartwell. Hartwell sat at the table's side with his hands flat and his expression unreadable. Elder Aldrich presented documentation that he indicated required immediate review by the assembled alphas. He paused. "In your absence, it fell to the senior alpha present." "What documentation?" "Territorial agreements, bloodline records, succession documentation from the Ashmore Pack archive." Hartwell's voice was careful, neutral in the specific way of someone who was holding their position until they knew which way the ground was moving. Elder Aldrich indicated that certain irregularities had come to light that affected the validity of agreements made under your authority. Irregularities. Aldrich's word, Aldrich's frame. The first telling. Kalen looked down the table at the assembled alphas, 12 faces running the full range of calculation, some openly interested, some guarded, some wearing the careful blankness of people who had decided not to commit to an expression until the outcome was clearer. He knew every face, had read every face across this table for years. He read them now and saw what was there. And what was there was not yet decided. Not fully. Aldrich had 40 minutes and the archives, but 40 minutes was not enough to finish the narrative. The room was still open. "Alpha Ashmore," Aldrich said, and his voice was the same as it had always been, measured, authoritative. The voice of someone who had been a respected elder for longer than most of the people in this room had been alive. "I understand this is difficult. What I have presented tonight is not intended as an attack on your authority. It is a correction of a record that has contained errors for some years, errors that I bear responsibility for allowing to persist. I am here tonight to correct them, in the interest of the Pack's stability and the summit's integrity." He was going to confess. Kalen understood it in the same moment he heard it begin. Aldrich was going to confess to something, a carefully shaped, carefully bounded something that positioned him as a man of conscience correcting an old mistake, rather than the architect of a 7-year deception. And he was going to do it before Kalen could establish his own account. And the room was going to receive it as the more credible version simply because it came with documentation and the appearance of voluntary disclosure. "The errors," Kalen said, "include the falsified death record of my mate, Celine Voss." The room received this. Aldrich's expression didn't change. The identification of Celine Voss as deceased was made in good faith on the basis of It was made on the basis of 3 Elder Council signatures on a document attesting to facts they knew to be false. Kalen reached into his coat and placed the identification record on the table. The oilcloth wrapping was still dark at the edges. This is the original record, recovered tonight from the Ashmore Secondary Archive. 3 signatures. One of the 3 signatory elders has provided a full written account of the circumstances under which the record was created. The room's quality of attention sharpened. Dane, Aldrich said. Not loudly, just the name. Dane, Kalen confirmed. Something moved through Aldrich's face then. Not the collapse of a guilty man, but the precise small recalculation of a strategist who has encountered an unexpected variable and is determining its weight. The recalculation was brief. His posture didn't change. Dane is frightened and old, Aldrich said, and his account of events will reflect that. Then the room can weigh his account against the documentation. Kalen looked at the assembled alphas. Against the identification record, against the account of the woman who has been living under a false name for 7 years because returning to Ashmore territory meant returning to the jurisdiction of the men who had falsified her death. He looked at the hall's side door. Celine. The side door opened. She walked in the way she had walked through the Hollow Fen wood, without performance, without announcement, with the particular quality of someone who has been moving through difficult terrain for a long time and has learned to move through it as if it were ordinary. She walked to the table and she stopped and she looked at Aldrich, and whatever she felt looking at him, she held it in the same container she had held everything for 7 years. Sealed, controlled, present only as a slight tightening around her eyes that anyone who wasn't watching carefully would have missed. The room was absolutely still. Aldrich looked at her. Whatever he had been, whatever calculation ran behind that settled face, something in it shifted when he saw her standing in the room. Not guilt, not regret, the recognition of a miscalculation. He had moved against Kalen tonight because Kalen was the opposition he had prepared for. Celine was a variable he had managed through absence, and absence was no longer available as a management strategy. Alpha Marek broke the silence first. Is this the woman named in the identification record? Yes, Kalen said. She can confirm her identity? She can. He looked at Celine. She nodded once. Then we have a living person whose documented death was certified by 3 Elder Council members. Marek looked down the table. That is not an irregularity. That is a falsification of pack record. The circumstances require context, Aldrich began. The context you've had 40 minutes to provide, Marek said, and her voice had taken on the edge it got during negotiations when she was done negotiating, which context did not include the fact that the woman was alive. Aldrich looked at Kalen. The first time, in all of this, that the old man's expression had moved past its settled surface into something more exposed. Not fear exactly. Something older than fear. The look of someone who has spent decades building a structure and is standing in the moment where the structure has become the thing that will fall on him. You were losing control of the pack, Aldrich said. His voice was still level, still measured, but it was doing different work now. Not the work of a man addressing a council chamber, but the work of a man addressing the person he had spent 12 years managing, perhaps for the first time without the architecture of management around it. I watched your father lead this pack. I watched your grandfather. I have watched alpha after alpha come into this chair, and I know what the chair does to a man when no one is counterweighting it. He looked at Kalen directly. You were 26, and you were becoming the kind of alpha who doesn't stop, who consolidates until there's nothing left to consolidate and then looks for something new to absorb. I have seen that before. I have seen what it costs. So you took my mate, Kalen said. The quiet in his voice had gone past discipline into something structural. You manufactured her death. You hid my child. You ran my pack on a false foundation for 12 years. Because you decided on behalf of everyone whose records you just stole and whose agreements you came here tonight to undermine, that your counterweight was worth all of that. I decided that the pack was worth all of that, Aldrich said. That is what I was appointed to decide. The room held that sentence. Hartwell spoke. His voice was careful, each word placed like someone crossing uncertain ice. Elder Aldrich, the documentation you've presented tonight, the archive materials. Under what authority were they removed from Ashmore Pact territory? Under the authority of the Elder Council Charter, which grants the Elder Council Charter grants custodial authority over Pact records, Hartwell said. It does not grant removal authority, particularly not unilateral removal in advance of a summit session. He looked at the document cases on the table. You anticipated that you would need these materials here tonight before your alpha arrived, which means you planned this presentation before the boy walked into this hall this morning. Silence. You didn't react to today, Hartwell said. You executed a plan that was already in place. He looked at Kaylin. How long ago did you know the boy existed? Aldrich said nothing. That's the question, Hartwell said, not to Aldrich now, but to the room. Not whether the records contain irregularities, not whether the identification was made in good faith. How long ago did this elder know that Alpha Ashmore had a living heir who had not been registered, and what decisions were made in that knowledge? Kaylin watched Aldrich's face. The old man was still. The stillness had changed, no longer the settled stillness of a man who had made his peace, but the stillness of someone holding very still over something that had no floor. Hartwell, Kaylin said, you told my lieutenant you had intelligence regarding a bloodline matter that your pack received 7 years ago. Hartwell looked at him steadily. I did. Tell the room what that intelligence contained. A pause. Hartwell's jaw shifted slightly, the internal movement of a man who has arrived at a decision point he knew was coming and had not fully resolved until this moment. Then he straightened in his chair and looked at the assembled alphas. 7 years ago, Hartwell said, an Iron Gate pack tracker identified a woman traveling through our western territories. The woman was identified as Selene Voss, maid of Alpha Ashmore, officially listed as deceased. He paused. I brought this to my pack's intelligence record, and I did not forward it to Ashmore Pack. Why? Marek said. Because I received separately and within the same month a communication from Elder Aldrich of the Ashmore Council indicating that the matter of Selene Voss's status was a closed internal pack matter, and that any intelligence regarding her movements should be routed through the Elder Council rather than directly to Alpha Ashmore. Hartwell held the room's attention with the flat precision of someone delivering a prepared statement. At the time, I assessed this as a succession matter, an internal dispute being managed at the council level, which is within Elder authority. I chose to hold my intelligence rather than insert Iron Gate into an Ashmore internal matter. You chose to hold leverage, Marek said. Yes, Hartwell said. That too. The room absorbed the full weight of this, the specific architecture of how a lie maintained itself, not through a single conspiracy, but through the accumulated decisions of many people who knew partial truths and chose, for their own reasons, not to complete them. Aldrich's plan had not required everyone to be a co-conspirator. It had only required everyone to make the choice that served their immediate interests, and the lie had sustained itself on the ordinary machinery of self-interest. Aldrich had understood that, had built for it. Kaylin looked at the old man and felt the specific cold clarity of a person who has stopped being surprised and started calculating. The archive materials on this table, Kaylin said. Every document is a pack record that was removed from Ashmore territory under false authority. They will be inventoried, sealed under Summit neutral custody, and returned. He looked at the Thornwall Hall guard captain, who had been standing at the wall throughout, and was now wearing the expression of someone who had not anticipated their evening involving this. Captain, you'll take custody of those cases. The captain looked at Aldrich, then at Kaylin. Then, with the decision of a man who understood which authority in this room had just established primacy, he moved toward the table. You don't have standing to order Summit neutral custody, Aldrich said. His voice had finally changed, the measurement gone, something harder underneath. You are one alpha at this table. He's not ordering it as one alpha, Hartwell said. I'm seconding it as Summit Senior. The materials stay in neutral custody until the Summit session formally reviews the falsification claim. He looked around the table. Any objection? Silence. The captain reached the table and began to close the document cases. Aldrich watched him do it, Watch the cases close over the archive materials he had ridden through the night to place in this room. Watch the prepared narrative, the 40 minutes of carefully arranged documentation, pass out of his hands and into neutral custody, which was the same as out of his hands entirely. He looked at Kaelin. "You think this is finished," Aldrich said. His voice was quiet. Stripped back to something that was not performance and not strategy, something that might have been, underneath 12 years of council chambers and measured tones, the actual man. You have a document and a living woman and a frightened elder's confession. You think that dismantles what was built. "I think it starts to," Kaelin said. "The pack will fracture. Every decision made under contested council authority is now open to challenge. Every alpha in this room has agreements with Ashmore that are now questionable. You're not restoring something. You're burning the foundation and calling it renovation." "The foundation was already burning," Kaelin said. "You built it that way." Something moved through Aldrich's face, the complicated movement of a man who has spent his life believing in the righteousness of his own architecture and is standing in the first moment where the belief has become structurally unsound. Not regret, not quite. Something more like the recognition that the story he had told himself about protecting the pack, about counterweighting an alpha who was becoming too much, had been true enough to sustain him for 12 years and was true enough no longer. "Kaelin," Aldrich said. Just the name, without the title, for the first time. Kaelin looked at him. "I taught you to read a room," Aldrich said. "Before anyone else. I taught you to watch the hands, not the face, to find the gap between what a man says and what he wants." He held Kaelin's gaze with something that was not an apology and was not a plea, but was the specific expression of someone acknowledging a debt that can no longer be paid. "I taught you everything I knew. I just didn't account for you learning it well enough to use it on me." The room was very still. Kaelin held the old man's gaze for 3 seconds. 2 seconds longer than necessary. 1 second longer than silence could hold without becoming a statement. Then he looked at the guard captain. "Take him." The captain moved. 2 neutral guards moved with him. Aldrich did not resist. He had the stillness of a man who had known this was the end of the thing since the moment the side door opened and Celine walked through it, and had decided that whatever came next would be faced with the same bearing he had maintained for 71 years, because the bearing was the only thing left that was still entirely his. They moved him toward the hall's side corridor. He walked past Celine. He stopped. She looked at him. He looked at her. The space between them held 7 years and 1 falsified document and a child who had grown up without a father in the Northern Territories, carrying a name that wasn't hers, learning to move smart and stay hidden. Aldrich said nothing. There was nothing available to say. Celine said nothing either. She held his gaze with clear eyes and no excess. And after 3 seconds, she looked away. Not in concession, not in anger, but the specific look away of someone who has concluded an accounting and found the numbers exactly as expected and has no further use for the face that generated them. Aldrich moved on. The guards took him out. The hall breathed. Kaelin stood at the head of the table and looked at the assembled alphas and felt the full weight of the room. 12 territorial powers recalibrating in real time, each of them running the same calculation about what the next hours and days required of them. The archive materials were in neutral custody. The falsification claim was on the record. Celine was in the room. Dane's confession was in writing back at Ashmore. The ground had shifted. It had not finished shifting. Hartwell spoke. "The summit session will need to formally record the falsification claim and determine a process for reviewing affected agreements." He looked at Kaelin. "That process will take time, and it will require your full cooperation with every alpha in this room who has standing agreements with Ashmore Pack." "I know," Kaelin said. "Some of those agreements will need renegotiation. Some alphas in this room may decide the instability of a pack in the middle of a council restructuring affects their territorial calculations." "I know that too." "It will not be simple," Hartwell said. "No," Kaelin said. "It won't." He looked at the room. "But every agreement that needs renegotiating will be renegotiated on the basis of what is actually true. Every territorial boundary will be confirmed or revised against actual facts. Every record will be what it says it is." He held the room's collective attention with the full weight of his presence, not with dominance, not with threat, but with the specific authority of a man who has paid the full cost of understanding what he is standing in. That is not instability. That is the only kind of stability that doesn't eventually collapse and take everyone standing on it down with it. Marek looked at him. Something in her expression that wasn't quite agreement, but was its immediate neighbor. You're asking us to trust a process that just demonstrated it can be corrupted. I'm asking you to participate in a process that is now being corrected, Kaelin said. Those are different things. Silence again. The torches burned. Outside, through the high windows, the night had gone fully dark, and the rain was coming back. Then Marek set both hands flat on the table, a deliberate, readable gesture, the gesture of someone establishing a position they intend to hold. The Stonefen Pack will remain at this summit until the formal review process is established, she said, and will participate in the renegotiation of any affected agreements. A pause. Hartwell placed his hands flat on the table, then the Coldwater twins, simultaneously, in the first synchronized action anyone at this table had witnessed from them in 6 years. One by one, around the table, hands went flat. Not unanimous. 2 alphas toward the far end held back, watching, calculating. But enough. More than enough to establish that the room was willing to hold. Kaelin breathed. He breathed through the reality of what was still ahead. The pack restructuring, the council reconstitution, the renegotiations, the long process of building something on a foundation that had been swept clean. The months of it. Possibly years. And Orion at Ashmore, sitting with Ferris in the East Yard, or sleeping in whatever room had been assigned to him, carrying the weight of a day that no 7-year-old should have had to carry. Learning the territory that was his inheritance, asking questions that would not stop coming. He looked at Celine. She was watching him from the side of the room with the expression that had no clean name, the one with 7 years of sediment in it, the one that would require more than a single night to begin to read accurately. But underneath the sediment there was something else. Something that was not about the past or the 7 years or the careful constructed survival of everything she'd built alone. Something that was about the next thing. He was about to move toward her, about to cross the room, about to begin the conversation that had no protocol and no precedent, when the hall's main door opened hard. Ferris, breathing like someone who had run the full distance from the courtyard without stopping. Alpha Ashmore, he said. His voice had the particular quality that Kaelin had learned over many years and many bad nights, to read as the sound of a situation that had just changed shape entirely. What? Kaelin said. The boy, Ferris said. He's gone. The word landed. What do you mean, gone? Kaelin said, and his voice was quiet in a register it had never quite occupied before. I left him in the East Room. He was sleeping. I checked on him an hour ago. He was there. Ferris's breathing was ragged. The window. It's open. He's not in the settlement. I've had 6 people checking the perimeter and he's not. The archive cases, Celine said, and her voice had gone very still and very precise in the way it got when she was operating on information faster than she could explain it. When the captain took custody. Aldrich. When the guards were moving him out the side corridor, Kaelin was already moving. He was already through the table and across the room and at the side corridor door before Ferris finished the sentence, before Celine had completed the thought that was completing itself in both their minds simultaneously. The corridor was empty. The guard who should have been stationed at the passage end was down, not dead, breathing, but down. The specific quality of someone who had been hit from behind with enough force and precision to take them out of the equation without noise. The side exit at the corridor's end was open, cold air coming through it, night beyond it, and from somewhere outside in the dark between the hall and the tree line, a single sound that stopped Kaelin's blood in a way that no amount of 12 years' fortification had prepared him for. A child's voice. Orion's voice. Not calling for help, his son did not call for help, had apparently decided at some point in his 7 years that calling for help was not an available strategy, had decided it so thoroughly that even now in whatever was happening in the dark outside that door, the sound that came back through the open exit was not a cry, but a sentence, spoken in the flat, certain voice of a child who had walked into the most dangerous room in the Northern Territories and looked the Alpha King in the eye without flinching. 3 words. I found him. Kalen went through the side exit at a dead run. The night outside was cold and fully dark between the torches, the rain coming down in the thin, persistent way that soaked through everything without drama. And he crossed the 10 yards of open ground between the hall's wall and the tree line with his hand on his blade and his eyes adjusting to the dark, and his chest doing something that had nothing to do with the exertion and everything to do with 3 words spoken in a child's flat, certain voice from somewhere in the black between the buildings. He heard Celine behind him. He didn't look back. The tree line was thin here, a corridor of scrub pine between the hall's back wall and the stable yard, the kind of space that existed because no one had decided what to build there yet. Dark enough to be useful if you needed to move someone without being seen from the courtyard. Dark enough that a 7-year-old boy who had grown up learning to listen and move smart could follow a guard's movements and slip through a window and arrive somewhere before anyone knew he was gone. He found them 15 feet into the trees. Aldrich was on his knees. Not because anyone had put him there, the old man had gone down on his own or had been going down when Orion found him, one hand against a pine trunk and the other at his chest in the specific posture of someone whose body had made a decision that the rest of him hadn't caught up to yet. The 2 neutral guards who had been escorting him were 3 feet away, one of them with a hand on his shoulder, neither of them looking like men who had expected their detainee to fold in the middle of the corridor. Orion was standing 2 feet in front of Aldrich, not touching him, not threatening him, standing the way he stood in the Thornwall Hall that morning, flat hands, straight back, the full attention of someone who had arrived at a place they had been moving toward all day and intended to be present for every part of it. Kalen stopped. He stopped because the scene required it, because walking into it at a run would have broken something that was already suspended in a specific balance, and he had learned in the last 12 hours that his son's stillness was not a thing to disrupt carelessly. Aldrich looked up. He looked at Kalen first, the instinct of someone who had spent his life calibrating toward the primary authority in any room, even a room that was a stand of wet pine in the dark. Then he looked back at Orion. "You followed me," the old man said. His voice was different from what it had been in the hall. The measurement was gone. Not stripped by force, but simply absent, the way a performance becomes absent when the performer has run out of something necessary to sustain it. "Yes," Orion said. "Why?" The boy was quiet for a moment. Rain on the pine needles overhead, the distant sound of the stable yard, Kalen's own breathing going slower as he held position at the tree line's edge. "Because you were going to leave," Orion said. "And you're the only person left who knows all of it." He held the old man's gaze with those gray-green eyes. "Not just what Dane knows, not just what the documents say. You know why. The whole reason from the beginning." A pause. "I want to know why." Aldrich looked at the child for a long time. The hand at his chest had moved to his knee, and his breathing was the unsteady breathing of exertion and something else. The specific labor of a body that had been carrying a weight for a very long time and had just set it down and was recalibrating to the difference. "You're his son," Aldrich said, not as identification, as an observation with weight behind it. "Yes," Orion said, "I can see it." The old man's voice had something in it that wasn't quite sorrow and wasn't quite recognition, the compound expression of someone arriving at a truth that they had been moving around for years and have finally stopped moving around. "I watched your father grow up, from before he was an alpha. When he was your age, he had the same—" He stopped. "The same way of standing in a room like he'd already decided the outcome." "Did that scare you?" Orion said. Aldrich looked at him. "Yes," he said, "it did." "Is that why you did it?" The question arrived without accusation, flat and honest in the way only children and the very tired could manage, the kind of question that didn't carry judgment because it was genuinely asking for the answer rather than performing the asking. Aldrich breathed, the unsteady breath of a man arriving at the last version of a thing he had told himself many times. "I did it because I believed the pack needed someone like me, between it and someone like him." He looked at his hands on his knee. I did it because I had spent 40 years being necessary, and I could feel that ending, and I told myself those two things were the same thing. A pause. For a long time I believed that. But they weren't, Orion said. No, Aldrich said. They weren't. The trees were quiet. Kalen stood at the edge of them and did not move and did not speak because his son was doing something that Kalen did not have the equipment to do in this moment, was asking the question without the 12 years of betrayal attached to it, was receiving the answer without the weight of everything the answer had cost, was getting to the truth of the man more directly than Kalen could, because Orion had not yet learned to protect himself from truth in the ways that adults learned. That was the thing about children who had grown up hard. They arrived at clarity faster than people who had been protected from it. The protection was supposed to be a gift. Sometimes it was just a longer route to the same destination. Kalen thought about the version of himself that had existed 7 years ago, 26 years old and consolidating, building, moving towards something he could feel the shape of but hadn't named yet. Aldrich had watched that and seen a threat, had responded to it the way threatened men responded, not by standing in front of the thing they feared, but by removing the condition that enabled it. He had been so certain of his own necessity, had been so convinced that the pack required his management that he had confused the pack's needs with his own, had run them through the same channel until they were indistinguishable. And he had not been wrong about everything. Kalen had been consolidating, had been building toward an authority that would have reduced elder influence, would have eventually made the council a ceremonial function rather than an operational one. He had been moving toward that the way he moved toward most things, without announcing it, with the settled patience of someone who understood that outcomes were a function of consistent direction over time. Aldrich had read that correctly. He had just answered it with something that could not be answered correctly. Kalen stepped out of the tree line. Aldrich looked up at him. The old man did not try to stand. He held Kalen's gaze from his knees in the wet pine needles with the expression of someone who has arrived at a place past strategy and past performance and is waiting for whatever comes next with the bare patience of exhaustion. "Get up," Kalen said. Not harshly, not gently, the way you said a thing that needed to be done. Aldrich got up. The guard helped him, and he didn't refuse the help, which was its own kind of information. The old man had spent his whole life refusing help, had made himself necessary by being the person others relied on rather than the person who relied. Accepting the guard's hand meant something had changed in the fundamental accounting of himself. They stood in the wet trees, the three of them, 4 with the guards present, and the rain came down quietly, and the distance between them held everything that had been said and everything that was still unresolved and everything that would never be fully resolved because some debts didn't have a payment structure, only an acknowledgement. "You'll give your full account to the summit," Kalen said. "Everything, not a shaped version, not the version that positions you as a man of conscience making a hard choice. The full account of what was decided and who decided it and what it was decided for." Aldrich looked at him. "And after?" After is a question for the summit's formal process. Kalen held the old man's gaze. "I won't make you a promise I don't have the authority to make. The pack assembly will determine consequences. The summit may have standing to weigh in." A pause. "What I can tell you is that I won't add to whatever the process delivers. Whatever comes from the formal accounting, that's where it ends. I won't carry it past that point." Something moved through Aldrich's face. The specific expression of a man who expected punishment and has been offered something more difficult, accountability without vengeance, which required him to face the thing he had done without the simplifying structure of an enemy to push against. "That's harder," Aldrich said quietly. "Yes," Kalen said. "It is." He looked at the guards. "Take him back inside." He looked at Orion. "You come with me." They walked out of the trees together, father and son, into the thin rain and the torchlight of the hall's courtyard. Celine was waiting at the side exit, her arms at her sides, her face holding the careful composite of someone who had heard enough from the tree line to know the shape of what had happened and was letting it settle. She looked at Orion. "You followed him," she said. "Yes," he said. She looked at him for 3 full seconds. The look of a mother running an assessment that went past the immediate situation into the longer history of a child who had spent his whole life watching her solve problems by moving smart and had applied that lesson to a situation she would not have chosen for him. "Okay," she said. Orion looked at her and then at Kaylin and then at the hall's entrance where the light came through in warm rectangles. "Are we going back in?" he said. "Yes," Kaylin said. "Is it finished?" Kaylin was quiet for a moment. He thought about what finished meant in the context of 12 years of falsified foundation and 7 years of necessary exile, and a pact that needed rebuilding from the council structure outward. He thought about the months of process ahead, the renegotiations, the pack assembly, the long, patient work of constructing something on ground that had been swept clean whether he'd chosen that or not. "The part where we don't know what's true," he said, "that part is finished." Orion considered this with the seriousness of someone assessing whether it was a sufficient answer. Apparently he decided it was, because he nodded once and walked through the door. The formal session ran until past midnight. Aldrich gave his account. He gave it in the measured voice that was the only voice he had. But the measurement was different now, not strategic, not shaped, but the voice of a man performing the last act of discipline available to him, which was to tell the truth with the same composure he had used to tell lies, because the composure had always been the only thing entirely his. The assembled alphas listened. Hartwell's testimony followed, his intelligence records confirmed and entered into the summit's formal account. Dane's written confession, carried north by the fast rider Petra had sent, arrived at the second hour and was read into record. The archive materials in neutral custody were inventoried. Every document was cataloged, signed over to a 3-alpha review committee appointed by Summit Consensus, Marek, Hartwell, and one of the Coldwater twins who had broken from his brother on the committee question in a fracture that would likely take another 6 years to fully articulate itself. The identification record for Celine Voss, deceased, was formally voided. That was the procedural language. Voided. A single word applied to a single document. What it meant in practice was that the paper architecture of 7 years of absence was dismantled in the time it took a Summit recorder to write a notation in the formal log. The lie had taken 3 men's signatures and 7 years of sustained management. The truth had taken 1 word. That disproportion was something Kaylin would think about for a long time afterward, the way a structure could take years to build and moments to correct, and how that asymmetry was not a feature of the structure's fragility, but of the truth's efficiency. Truth didn't require maintenance. It just required arriving. Celine stood through the formal session with the composure she had worn through everything, the specific composure of someone who has been waiting a very long time for a room like this one and had learned, in the waiting, not to need the room in order to be who she was. The voiding of the document didn't change her. She had been alive through all 7 years of it. What it changed was the official record, the external architecture of how the world understood her existence, and that mattered. It mattered for Orion, for the pack, for the agreements that needed correcting, but it was not the thing that made her real. She had stayed real on her own, without documentation, without a territory, without anyone's formal acknowledgement. She had stayed real through the necessity of a child who needed her to be. That was what survival actually looked like, stripped of everything convenient about it. Not resilience as a quality someone was born with. Resilience as the accumulated result of choosing, every morning, to keep going, not because the outcome was guaranteed, but because the alternative was a kind of death that didn't require dying. The session closed at the first hour past midnight. The alphas dispersed to their accommodations. The hall emptied. Kaylin sat at the table in the quiet afterward, alone for the first time since the Ashmore corridor, when he had allowed himself 4 breaths and sealed what needed sealing. He sat with his hands flat on the table, the gesture that had meant something different an hour ago when 12 alphas made it, and now meant something different again, private. The gesture of a man taking stock of what the surface under his hands actually was. He thought about what it cost to be wrong about trust, not the betrayal, the trust itself. The willingness to extend it, to make yourself legible to another person's judgment, to allow someone's version of you to matter. He had been formed, in the years since Celine's disappearance, by the absence of that, had built everything on his own perception of himself, had made his assessment the only one that counted because it was the only one he could verify, had become, in the process, very good at his job and very alone in the specific way of people who have confused self-sufficiency with strength. Self-sufficiency was a wall. Strength was something else. Strength was what it took to come back from the wall and try again on different terms. Not the same terms, not the naive terms of before, but the harder terms of someone who knew the cost now and was choosing to pay it anyway. That was not a lesson he had been ready for at 26. He was not certain he had been fully ready for it at 33. He was less certain than ever that readiness was a prerequisite, rather than a story people told themselves about why they were waiting. He heard footsteps. Celine came back into the hall from the side passage. She had put Orion to bed in one of the hall's back rooms. The boy had gone without argument, which was either exhaustion or the considered decision of someone who understood that adults needed the room. Possibly both. She walked to the table and sat down across from where Kaylin was sitting, not at the far end, not beside him, across, the distance of a table between them, which was honest. They sat in the quiet for a moment. "He'll ask more questions tomorrow," she said. "I know. He won't stop asking them. That's not how he's built." "I know that too." Kaylin looked at her. "I'll answer them." "All of them." "All of them." She held his gaze. The torches had burned low, and the hall had the specific quality of late-night spaces that have held a great deal of noise and have gone quiet, not empty, but resting. Her face in the low light had the layers in it that he had not had time to read since the hollow fen wood, all the sediment of 7 years sitting above something that was older than the sediment and had survived it. "I'm not the same person," she said, not as a warning. As a fact being placed on the table between them, the way you placed a document that needed to be acknowledged before anything else could proceed. "I know," he said. "You don't, fully. You know the fact of it. The shape of who I am now is something you'd have to—" She paused. "It takes time. I'm not saying that as a condition. I'm saying it as the truth of the thing." "Then we take the time," Kaylin said. "You make that sound simple." "It's not simple," he said. "Nothing about the next year is going to be simple. The PAC restructure, the council appointments, the renegotiations, none of that is simple. You'll be navigating a territory that was managed in your absence by people who had reasons for that absence. Orion is going to be introduced into a PAC structure as an heir whose existence was concealed, and there will be people who find that convenient, and people who find it threatening, and people who haven't decided yet." He held her gaze. "None of it is simple. But the thing underneath it, what I want the next year to be, that part is simple. I want you there. Both of you." Celine was quiet. Outside, the rain had finally stopped. The absence of it was its own sound. The specific silence of a night that had been wet for hours and has gone dry. The quiet of things that have been soaked through and are beginning, slowly, to drain. "Orion told me something tonight," she said. "Before I put him to bed." She paused. "He said he wasn't angry at you." Kaylin waited. "I asked him why. He said—" She stopped. Something moved through her face. "He said because you didn't know. And the people who did know made sure you didn't. And being angry at someone for not knowing a thing that was kept from them was like being angry at the dark for not being light." The hall was very still. "He's 7 years old," Kaylin said. "He's been thinking about it for a long time," Celine said. "Since last winter, when he found the box. He had months of working it out before he decided to walk into that hall." She paused. "He decided to come because he'd already decided not to be angry. He came because he wanted to know you, not to confront you, to know you." Something in the fortified structure of Kaylin's chest developed a fracture that had nothing to do with damage and everything to do with the specific force that only arrives when something you had stopped believing in appears directly in front of you and turns out to be real. He breathed through it. He did not seal it. He let it stay open, which was harder than sealing it, and which was, he was beginning to understand, the only version of carrying something that didn't eventually require the structure to collapse. "What do you need?" he said. Not performing the question, asking it. The way you asked a question you actually needed the answer to. Celine looked at him for a long moment. The gray-green of her eyes in the low torchlight was the same color it had been 7 years ago, and a different color entirely, which was how color worked when you were looking at the same thing with a different pair of years behind you. Honesty, she said. Not performed honesty. Not the honesty you give a council chamber. The kind where you tell me when something isn't working before it becomes something we're managing instead of addressing. She paused. I spent 7 years managing instead of addressing. I know what that costs. I won't do it again. Neither will I, he said. Slow, she said. Not because the feeling isn't. She stopped, chose the direct route. Slow because Orion needs to find his way into this at the pace that's right for him. He's not a footnote to whatever this is. He's the reason any of it matters. He's the reason I rode into the Hollowfin Wood, Kaelin said. And he's the reason I stayed in the trees instead of interrupting what he was doing in them. He held her gaze. He comes first. She held his gaze for 3 seconds, 4, 5, long enough for the sentence to arrive and be assessed and be found accurate. Then something in her face did the thing it had almost done in the Hollowfin Wood and had been preventing since, not collapse, not release, but the specific settling of a person who has been holding themselves at full tension for so long that the first moment of genuine safety registers as almost painful. She nodded once. They sat in the quiet hall a while longer, not talking, and the quiet was not empty. 3 weeks later, on a cold morning with frost on the Ashmore Ridge and the first real winter light cutting low across the valley, Orion found Kaelin in the east yard. He had been finding him there most mornings, not by design, not arranged, but because Kaelin went to the east yard at first light to think, and Orion had noticed and had begun arriving there too, with the same studied casualness of someone who was doing a thing intentionally but did not want to make it into more than it was yet. They stood at the fence and looked at the valley the way they had looked at it the first day, except now it was 3 weeks of mornings layered under it, 3 weeks of questions and answers and the occasional long silence that had slowly changed its quality from uncertain to something more like the silence of people who were learning the rhythm of each other's quiet. Petra said the Stonefen agreement is done, Orion said. Signed yesterday, Kaelin confirmed. That's the 4th one. 5th. The Coldwater eastern boundary was 3rd. He looked at the boy beside him. You've been keeping count. I've been keeping count, Orion confirmed without apology. Why? The boy was quiet for a moment. His hands were in his pockets, the posture he had that meant he was thinking rather than bracing. Because every one that gets renegotiated is one that's real now, he said. Not built on the wrong thing, real. He paused. I want to know when they're all real. Kaelin looked at his son, at the jaw that was his jaw and the eyes that were Celine's, and the way of standing in a yard that was apparently just Orion's own, assembled from both of them and from 7 years of hard learning into something that belonged to nobody else. He thought about what it meant to build something real. Not the negotiation of it, not the legal architecture, the actual substance. The thing that made an agreement worth the paper it was written on was not the documentation. It was the willingness of the people who signed it to carry the cost of keeping it. And the cost of keeping things real was not paid once at the signing. It was paid daily, in the small, unglamorous decisions about whether to be honest when honesty was inconvenient, whether to address things directly when managing them sideways was easier, whether to stay in the room when leaving, it would feel better in the short term. That was what the next years required. Not heroism. Heroism was the easy part, the single moment of decision under pressure that people remembered because it was clean and visible and had a shape. What came after heroism was harder and less visible and lasted longer, and it was the part that actually determined whether the thing you had fought for became something that endured or something that repeated. He had fought for a lot of things, had won most of them, had built the structure of his authority on the assumption that winning was the objective. He was 33 years old, standing in the east yard of his settlement with his son beside him in the frost, and he was just beginning to understand that winning was the beginning of the work, not the end of it. They'll all be real, he said. It takes time. I know, Orion said. I'm good at waiting. Kaelin looked at him. Where did you learn that? My mother, Orion said simply. Across the yard, Celine came out of the main hall with a cup of something hot. her breath visible in the cold air, her pace the unhurried pace of someone who is not running and does not need to run and has begun to remember what that feels like. She saw them at the fence, and she didn't call out or change her direction. She walked toward them with the same economy she brought to everything, and when she reached the fence, she stood on Orion's other side and looked at the valley. The three of them stood in the frost and the early light and the quiet of a morning that had nothing in it that needed managing. Kalen did not put his arm around her. He did not perform the reunion for an audience that wasn't there. He stood beside her and felt the reality of her presence, the specific gravity of a person standing close after a long absence, and let it be what it was without requiring it to be more yet. She looked at him sideways. He looked at her. Something passed between them in that look that had no name and required none. The specific communication of two people who had each spent 7 years building themselves into the shape the absence required, and were beginning, slowly and without rushing, the process of learning the new shapes. Orion looked at both of them and said nothing, which was the wisdom of a child who had spent 7 years learning to read a room. The valley below the fence was cold and clear and entirely real. And the morning held all of them, without ceremony, without conclusion, without the need for either, just the simple and sufficient fact of 3 people standing in the same yard on the same ground under the same winter light, present to each other after a long time of not being, which was not the end of anything but the first true beginning of the thing that came after truth. The thing that was harder than surviving. The thing called living.